On the piece of paper was written a question that sounded like an absolute truth. Who is the most beautiful person in the empire? And the answer to it was so obvious that it left no doubt. Surrounded by picturesque nature, where the snow-white gazebo harmoniously merged with the butterflies dancing in the air, she stood as if the embodiment of an ideal and unearthly beauty. Her hair, deep black, flowed down to her thin waist, and her eyes, shining with an unearthly blue, resembled stars twinkling in the night sky, full of magic and mystery. Irvin Lilius, daughter of the powerful Archduke Verma and wife of the influential Duke Carline, was consistently considered the most charming woman in the empire, whose beauty inspired poets and artists. However, behind her pretty appearance hid a steely character and a dark soul full of contradictions, which made her a complex and unpredictable person. This woman, who dedicated her life to serving the country, was known for her rudeness and irritability, and her arrogance often forced her servants to suffer humiliation and cruel words. Moreover, despite the outward signs of respect deep down, Irvin harbored a sincere hatred for her husband, hiding it behind a mask of decency. On the throne with regal grace and silver hair sat the young aristocrat Fervin Carline, whose natural charisma attracted the gaze, and he did not miss the opportunity to note that the maiden, despite her beauty, had an unbearably impatient disposition. Sitting at a round table with other nobles, Fervin discussed the latest news regarding his marriage to Duchess Irvin, which had already lasted for 4 difficult years. When the conversation turned to his wife, the man with a slight grin advised his interlocutors to ask Irvin herself this question, leaving her the right to reveal the secrets of their relationship. Clutching his head with barely noticeable irritation, Fervin admitted that recently his wife seemed to be deliberately avoiding him, which caused him bewilderment and hidden disappointment. The woman, hiding her face behind an elegant scarlet fan, looked like the embodiment of an ice devil, cold, mysterious, and completely inaccessible. One of the nobles, rising from his seat with undisguised irritation, loudly declared that they should insist to the emperor on the dissolution of the marriage and arrange for Fervin to marry another girl more submissive and suitable for the role of wife. Fervin, slowly resting his head on his fist, discreetly rejected this idea, noting that such a decision in the context of diplomacy could be seen as disrespectful and create trouble, and therefore he could only patiently wait out the remaining year of their marriage. However, the aristocrat did not calm down, persistently reminding those gathered that Fervin was already 25 years old, and the time to provide for an heir seemed to be running out irretrievably. In a cold and even tone, Fervin calmly noted that his powers for procreation were still in order, and as an example, he cited his own father, who, being 40 years old, easily conceived him. Unable to withstand the stream of reproaches and intrusive advice, the young duke restrainedly but firmly pointed to the door, making it clear that the conversation was over, and ordered the advisors to immediately leave the hall. Insulted by his decision, the grown men accustomed to their influence were extremely upset and clearly unhappy with such a sharp turn of events, which crossed out their expectations. Opposite them, with graceful elegance and proud bearing, stood a charming woman with long, wavy hair, whose gaze radiated a hidden determination. It seemed that her presence here was connected with an attempt to once again obtain financial assistance. The gray-haired old man, carefully taking the elegant cup of tea in his hands, hesitantly raised his eyes to the Duchess, and quietly asked for what purpose she had decided to gather them in this hall at such an unusual time. Her cold eyes, sparkling like precious stones in expensive earrings, looked around at those present with a stern and strict gaze, instantly silencing any attempts to object. Hiding her scarlet lips behind an elegant fan, the woman loudly and confidently announced that from now on, she had decided to completely cancel all previous financial investments intended for the Verma Duchy. The men, stunned by such an unexpected statement, froze in place, their faces distorted with a mixture of surprise and bewilderment, and their gazes were riveted on the woman, who seemed to have suddenly changed. Her graceful hand, trembling slightly, pressed itself to her chest, and her lips parted as if preparing to utter words that would no doubt echo throughout the empire. Gathering her courage and slightly lowering her gaze, the girl closed her eyes, clearly overwhelmed by the weight of her thoughts, and holding back the trembling in her voice, asked to convey that from now on she would abandon the previous practice of forbidding the extortion of money from the peasants. As the nobles exchanged glances and left the hall, each of them was deep in thought and loudly discussing among themselves the changes in the woman's behavior, wondering what could have made her change so suddenly. When no one around her was looking at her anymore, Irvin's face changed from sweet and soft to cold and ruthless, and her lips curved into a cruel and mocking smile. Tired of what was happening, the girl leaned heavily back in her chair, feeling how exhaustion was gradually taking over her body, as if every minute of this meeting was taking away her vitality. Lightly rubbing her shoulder with her hand, she quietly muttered under her breath that she needed to quickly deal with all the sins and consequences left behind by the real Irvin, the one who lived in this body before she appeared. The book this story was taken from was called Fervine and Stella, and was an intriguing story full of unexpected twists and turns, where intrigue and mystery were intertwined with drama, keeping readers in suspense until the very end. The girl's hands were tightly clutching the book, as if trying to hold on to the last of her strength, and behind her stood a basket with things that testified to the recent changes in her life. The beauty, with hair as black as night and eyes as deep as the abyss, abruptly slammed the book shut, and unable to hide her fatigue, said that despite everything that was happening, they could count on her help despite her inner doubts. She had only recently become a part-time singer, and the sleepless nights, grueling rehearsals, and nonstop work had begun to take their toll on her physical and emotional state, turning her every move into a feat. The woman's hand trembled, and the book itself seemed to lose its last strength. As if having fulfilled its duty, it slipped from her fingers, slowly sliding down, and fell to the floor with a quiet, ringing sound. Taking a step back, the maiden, unable to contain her fatigue any longer, collapsed on the floor, closing her eyes, and at that moment, her body, giving up any further struggle, sank into sleep, which seemed to be the only salvation. When she opened her eyes again, she was met with a sight she would hardly have expected. A ceiling covered in expensive panels and rich trim, as if to create a sense of luxury and power. Also, when the lady woke up, suddenly realizing that her surrounding reality was not the same as before, she jumped up with a squeal and instantly sat up on the bed, realizing that she was not alone in this mysterious place. Next to her, lying on the bed, was a young man wearing a shirt that hugged his body tightly, with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, which added a certain casual elegance to his appearance, despite the strange situation. He had lovely curly platinum hair that fell softly over his shoulders, like a silk thread, and his skin was snow-white and flawless, almost transparent, like that of a statue carved from precious marble. He was as beautiful as it was possible to be, even in his peaceful sleep. His features were as perfect as an ancient Greek sculpture, every line and curve a work of art. The beauty, looking at him, shyly covered her face with her hand, feeling how the blush gradually flooded her cheeks until she could not take her eyes off his amazing, almost unearthly appearance, feeling how her heart began to beat faster from excitement and awkwardness. When he moved seemingly by accident in his sleep, her heart skipped a beat, and the maiden involuntarily shuddered, as if this barely noticeable gesture had disturbed her soul, making it feel that it had become a part of this world. Covering herself completely with the blanket, she tried to comprehend how she ended up in this luxurious mansion next to a stranger. Her thoughts were confused, and she could not understand what had happened. Suddenly, as if with lightning speed, the stranger's hand abruptly pulled the blanket off her, leaving her body naked in the cold air. The hand smoothly reached for her black silky hair, involuntarily touching it, as if checking if she was dreaming. The guy, noticing her anxiety and bewilderment, gently but persistently asked the lady to wake up, gently stroking the lady's head, as if trying to bring her back to this world, to help her find support, warming her with his touch. The man, observing her confusion, slowly, tenderly touched her lips with his, kissing the lady softly and carefully, hugging her face as if wanting to make sure that she was here, that she was close, and that this was not just a figment of her imagination. When she opened her eyes, she was met with the surprised gaze of the man, who seemed to be equally stunned that his actions had led to this beautiful woman regaining consciousness despite everything that was happening. The man sitting next to the bed was a healer, and he loudly and confidently informed the maids standing nearby that everything was fine with the mistress, and now there was no need to worry since her health was restored. The servants, hearing the words of the healer, immediately bowed deeply before the mistress, who was sitting on the bed with obvious respect and reverence, as usually happens in such cases, demonstrating their devotion. The girl froze awkwardly, not immediately realizing that the servant was addressing her directly, because everything that was happening seemed so unusual and unexpected that she simply did not have time to understand what was happening. However, when she turned her head and saw her reflection in the mirror standing nearby, she froze because in front of her was a woman with curly hair, which at the moment of sight seemed strangely familiar. Her feet, stepping hesitantly onto the soft carpet, felt its velvety texture, and the girl felt a cold shiver run through her body, causing her heart to beat a little faster with anxiety. The girl, not believing her eyes, reached out her hand to the mirror surface, as if hoping that it was just an optical illusion. But the mirror did not lie, and her reflection was completely different. There was a reflection of a completely unfamiliar woman with bright blue eyes, and only after looking at her face she realized that in front of her was an image of the main villain of the novel, Irvin, whose name was associated with the darkest events in history. In the novel, Irvin screamed until the very end, demanding justice, claiming that all the accusations against her were unfair, and tried at every step to prove her innocence, despite the fact that no one believed hers. She was the only one in whose veins the blood of the ancient noble family of Verma flowed, and this was known to everyone, because there were always numerous guards around her, carefully guarding every step of the beauty. As a result, she married one of the most handsome dukes of her time, and their marriage became a true symbol of prosperity and the union of two powerful houses serving to strengthen the power and welfare of the state. However, despite the fact that 4 years had already passed since their wedding, no heir had appeared, and rumors began to circulate in society that the lady was unable to bear a child, which led to secret conversations and doubts among those closest to her and the courtiers. And one day, at the most unexpected moment, the glass broke, and with it, that ideal picture of their happiness collapsed. The marriage of two young people was dissolved like a fragile illusion that could not stand the test of time and betrayal. Someone had poured poison into the Duke's drink, and in the blink of an eye, everyone began to blame his cruel wife, believing that she, suffering from humiliation and rumors, could take this step in order to get rid of her husband, who had become a burden to her in the eyes of society. As a result, the girl was brought to trial, and a death sentence was handed down, which seemed inevitable despite all her attempts to justify herself and prove her innocence. Irvin screamed to the very end with tears in her eyes that she was not guilty, that no one should believe these accusations, but her words found no response in the hearts of the judges and those who were present at the trial. Everyone looked at her with soulless, cold eyes from top to bottom. Even the one who once loved her with all his heart has now become her greatest enemy, his gaze full of hatred, as if all the love they shared was forgotten and erased like an illusion. The light from the lady's blue eyes disappeared as if life itself had left her, and instead of the former pride and confidence, only a shadow of despair and bitterness from the loss of everything she once considered hers remained on the woman's face. The Duke, leaving behind his former feelings, found himself a new wife named Stella, who became his ideal, and they lived a long and happy life while the shadow of the past hung over him, but was forgotten by everyone except Irvin herself. The girl was horrified and could not understand why she was the one in the villain's body, clutching her cheek as if trying to feel that this was just a nightmare, but in fact it was reality, and fear was taking hold of her with every passing moment. The beauty could barely hold back her tears, feeling how hard it was to breathe. Looking in the mirror, she clenched her hands into fists, as if trying to maintain the remnants of control. Although she understood that she was no longer able to change what was happening, Irvin, noticing the maid standing nearby, turned to her, and she, without thinking, immediately bowed her head in a deep bow, which was a sign of respect and submission, as it had always been in their relationship, despite the tragic changes in the life of the mistress. The maid respectfully reminded her mistress that she had been married to her husband for 5 years, and as she said these words, she could not help but notice how something more than just memories flashed in Irvin's eyes. The surprised maid froze shocked when she received unexpected words of gratitude from her cruel mistress, which seemed almost inconsistent with how she was accustomed to perceive her mistress. Irvin herself, clenching her hand into a fist, firmly decided that she would change her fate, that she would not allow her life to end the way many expected, and with each passing moment, her confidence grew that she would survive, despite all the trials and obstacles that stood in her way. The first person whose opinion was truly important for changing her fate was her own husband, on whom not only her personal life depended in the future, but also many other events that could radically change her future. Suddenly, the door burst open with a bang, and the lady, taken by surprise, froze in place, seeing the guy who, without receiving an invitation, shamelessly invaded the chambers, thereby disturbing her peace and privacy. The man's footsteps were heavy and confident, each step he took on the wooden floor echoing in the room, and his presence immediately filled the atmosphere with tension and the inevitable feeling that something important was happening. The maids, seeing their master approaching, bowed deeply, without hesitation, showing the respect and obedience that was always characteristic of them in his presence, no matter what happened. Fervin froze in front of his wife. Their eyes met, and for a moment time seemed to stand still, because in those eyes was reflected all the pain and tension that had accumulated over the years of their marriage, as well as unresolved issues. He bowed his head in respect, but his voice was cold when he asked about Irvin's well-being, as if it was just a formal question that didn't hide any concern or interest, just an aloofness that was hard to ignore. The girl instantly remembered how this same guy had previously slept on her bed, and the memories filled her with anxiety and anger. The thought of his presence in such an intimate place left an unpleasant aftertaste, as if something important had been forgotten. Without waiting for an answer, Fervin turned around and, taking a few steps back, headed towards the door, realizing that the lady was fine since she was able to stand on her own feet, and apparently she did not need his help or care. However, Irvin, unable to contain her emotions, screamed loudly, desperately, protesting that this was not the case at all, and stretched out her hand in front of her, as if trying to stop Fervin or keep his attention on her despite his aloofness. Her fingers gripped the sleeve of his shirt, her grip tight, as if she was desperately trying to keep him from leaving, refusing to let go despite her best efforts to hide the pain and confusion that filled her soul. Fervin, a little surprised by her reaction, stood frozen in place, as if not knowing what to do next, and with a cold but not devoid of curiosity, look asked what exactly was wrong with her claim. It was her mental struggle. The lady, with a blush on her cheeks, thanked her husband shyly, her voice sounding quiet and timid, as if she herself did not expect to be able to utter these words, despite all the pain and inner turmoil that she had to endure. The servants standing nearby were shocked by such strange behavior of their mistress. They covered their faces, unable to hide their surprise and alarm, looking at the reaction that seemed completely inappropriate to the situation, and caused them a feeling of fear. But Fervin, hearing the words, jerked back his gaze, reflecting suspicion and disgust, as if he did not believe in his wife's sincerity, could not believe that she had really changed, and was sure that this was just another game. The beauty, seeing such a reaction, shuddered in horror. Her heart sank, as if her husband's cold gaze had struck her most vulnerable points, making her feel that everything she had tried to create was doomed to failure. The man walked slowly down the long corridor, and behind him remained the mustard, its bright shade seeming out of place against the gloomy backdrop, creating a strange, almost mystical feeling. The Duke, absorbed in his thoughts and reflections, resolutely stepped into the library, where the shelves lined with books created an atmosphere of deep knowledge and ancient wisdom, which emphasized the grandeur of this place. With one confident movement of his hand, he abruptly and decisively slammed the door, as if to emphasize the completeness of his action, and instantly silence reigned around him, broken only by the light rustling of pages. He could no longer contain the blush that flared brightly on his cheeks, and in an attempt to hide his embarrassed reaction, he quickly covered his face with his hand, hoping that no one would notice his embarrassment, blushing like a lobster. He had not expected the lady to change so much after the kiss they had shared that night, a change in her gaze, her manner, and even the way she carried herself, as if the night itself had left an indelible mark. Calling Mrs. Teeley, who was standing behind the door, he said in a voice full of strength and determination, with an echo of command, that he had an important order that he was instructed to convey to her, leaving no room for doubt. The woman closed her eyes understandingly, as if thinking about the words, and replied that she had also noticed changes in the lady's behavior, but she believed that it was too early to draw conclusions since the changes could be temporary and insignificant. But one thing was absolutely clear. The lady in black had changed, becoming much softer and more gentle, as if the heavy shadow that had darkened her soul had begun to gradually recede, leaving behind bright traces of change. Fervin couldn't understand how people could change so quickly. As if in an instant, life turns upside down, and a person who had just been completely different becomes completely new, which remained a mystery to him. The blue ribbon on her hair, black as night, testified to the change. The maiden had changed so quickly after a long illness that she was probably tired of being surrounded by thorns and was striving for something lighter and calmer. Suddenly, the man's face changed. His expression became heavy and full of sadness. A feeling of disappointment arose within him, as if all his hopes, which he considered real and important, turned out to be only illusions, mirages that would never come true. The maid obediently bowed her head slightly in agreement when she received her master's permission to leave the room. It was something of a release for her, as if she could finally take a break from her duty, although she remained in anticipation of new assignments. Standing alone in the quiet library, where silence reigned between the shelves, Fervin pushed the hair that was stuck to his forehead with one hand, feeling how its weight reminded him of his inner restlessness and the thoughts that did not give him peace. He remembered how Irvin, with a slight blush on her cheek so sweetly, thanked him for his help, and at that moment she looked so sincere and touching that his heart was filled with warmth and a soft feeling. The nobleman's teeth clenched, and only one thought came into his mind. Everything that was happening around him was complete madness, something absurd that defied any explanation or logic. The villainess, sitting on her throne, with a grin as if she were the mistress of the whole situation, did not utter a word, silently watching what was happening, except for the rare orders that she gave with cold determination and force. Those with whom she spoke could be counted on the fingers of one hand, because her circle of communication was so limited and selected that every conversation with her remained important and special. And also, with a smile, the maid came up and asked if she had enjoyed the meal, showing sincere attention and care for the mistress. Hoping that everything was exactly as she expected, happily responded to Tilly by saying that the food was incredibly delicious and expressed her gratitude, emphasizing how important it was for her to enjoy such a beautiful and carefully prepared dish. When the lady addressed the servant so politely for the first time, the latter felt some confusion and fear, not being accustomed to such a tone and manner of communication, which made her a little confused in this unusual situation. Now she spoke calmly with the maid, and a warm conversation began between them, filled with light and pleasant words, creating an atmosphere of friendliness and comfort in their communication. When the lady asked why the maid looked so tired, the servant replied with relief that her master had planned to have dinner at home that day, and that was why there was a lot of noise and bustle in the mansion due to preparations. The lady in her new red dress, which superbly showed off her exquisite figure, with a gracious smile, allowed Marianne the maid to enter, as if inviting her to continue her duties with dignity. The maid said, in a frightened, loud voice, with obvious tension in her voice, that the food had already been served and that the lady's husband was already waiting for her downstairs. The words sounded like an alarming warning that time was of the essence. Irvin was a little distracted. Her feminine thoughts were broken, but despite this, she gratefully thanked her niece Tilly. Her words sounded sincere, like an expression of warmth and appreciation. The maid was surprised that the young people, for the first time in a long time, decided to sit down at the table and eat, despite their obvious fatigue and worries. This was something unusual, because before they had refused to eat for a long time. The hand carefully carried the tray, and at that moment the woman's fingers barely touched its edges, as if they were very sensitive and ready at any moment to be frightened or make the slightest movement. Dressed in a dress reminiscent of a delicate flower, the girl realized that perhaps now was the time to make a good impression on her husband, especially at the table where every gesture and every word had a special meaning. Tilly's niece would not hesitate to offer her mistress to help her choose and put on another newer dress, not doubting that it would look perfect and emphasize her beauty. Noticing the maid trembling behind her, the lady looked at her with suspicion, unsure if she was afraid of her, or if there was something else that made the incredible beauty nervous at such a moment. The maid shook her head in fear, shouting that she was not afraid at all, trying to convince her mistress of this, not wanting to cause her anger or displeasure. Without thinking twice, Li's niece, realizing the seriousness of the situation, instantly fell to her knees, asking for forgiveness, deeply repenting that she could have unintentionally upset her mistress. The young lady, sensing the tension in the air, asked the hostess to tell her directly what exactly she was not happy with, rather than express it through hints, confident that only a frank conversation could resolve the problem. Covering her face with her hand, Irvin, sensing the tension in the air, decided to smoothly steer the conversation in another direction by suggesting that they should start with the makeup, which was truly carefully prepared and planned to look flawless. The maid's hand, which was carefully holding the brush, was visibly shaking, and it was clear that she was trying to concentrate, but nervousness and excitement could not go away, causing her gestures to become even more uncertain. Irvin, with a soft and reassuring smile, tried to console Marian, assuring her that she had absolutely no reason to worry about this because everything that happened was completely insignificant and easily resolved. With a slight blush on her face, the maid was truly amazed, and at the same time glad that her mistress, despite all possible worries, showed such a calm and restrained reaction that it became noticeable to everyone around. Everyone began to notice how much the beauty who had been married for 4 years had changed. She seemed to have transformed so naturally and imperceptibly that her changes were almost unrecognizable, but clearly noticeable to everyone. When the girl, with slight excitement, opened her eyes to look at her new makeup, she shuddered in surprise. Red lips, scarlet cheeks, and an overly bright, sometimes vulgar image became a real shock for her. Grabbing her face with her hands, the girl in horror turned to Marian and asked what she had done to her face, which made the maid almost tremble with fear, not expecting such a turn of events and fearing the consequences of her actions. Realizing that this was another test from her cruel mistress, the girl quickly realized that her mistakes were not forgiven, and feeling panic began to apologize, trying to justify her actions, but realizing that perhaps it would not help. In front of the mirror stood a bowl of water and a rag ready to help when small imperfections needed to be corrected. All this created a feeling of order and calm despite the growing excitement. Irvin wiped her makeup away in frustration, feeling her feelings and thoughts getting all mixed up at the moment. She couldn't help but notice that her appearance wasn't what she expected, and it was irritating her more and more. Turning her head towards the tray of flowers held by the maid, Irvin noticed how the delicate petals caught her attention. It was a moment when she allowed herself to be slightly distracted and appreciate how these flowers could complement her outfit. Reaching her hands towards the flower petals, the lady, touching their soft texture in surprise, thought that they would be a wonderful addition to decorate the outfit, giving the whole image a sophisticated finish and elegance. However, on this day, Irvin decided to decorate her hair not with bright roses as usual, but with delicate and innocent lilies of the valley, which was an unexpected and very symbolic decision, emphasizing her new, more sophisticated image. Li's shocked niece couldn't take her eyes off her mistress, who suddenly changed her character, becoming more reserved and calm, which caused her anxiety and a feeling of uneasiness. Fervin sat at the table, his gaze empty and meaningless. He seemed not to notice anything around him and only mechanically followed the surface of the table, absorbed in his thoughts, which clearly led him far from reality. His hand gripped the paper tightly, as if trying to contain the storm of emotions it had evoked. Every word written on that sheet seemed too important, and he couldn't afford to lose a single detail. The boy loudly called his palace servant, whose name was Alfred, hoping that he would quickly come and carry out his instructions without wasting time to help solve the problem that had arisen. After which, he persistently asked the servants why the food had not yet been brought, despite the fact that it was already late, and his patience was running out, and the wait was dragging on longer and longer. Alfred, lowering his head, reminded them that they were awaiting the arrival of the Duke's lady wife, and perhaps this was delaying the serving of food, since every gesture and decision was now under close scrutiny. Fervin cried out loudly in displeasure, and could not believe that the lady would deign to come down and eat with him at all, for her behavior of late had been so distant that it seemed she had long ceased to be interested in his company. However, at that moment, as if in response to his words, Irvin appeared with a slight smile, all in red, with delicate lilies of the valley in her hair. She said tenderly that she simply wanted to eat with her husband, which sounded like a tender gesture despite her usually reserved nature. The nobleman's mouth dropped open in surprise, and his eyes widened as if he couldn't believe what was happening. His expression was a mixture of surprise and admiration, as if he was seeing this side of his wife for the first time. Looking down, the noblewoman explained that all this time, she had literally been choosing an outfit, carefully choosing each element to look perfect, but she could not decide what would be most appropriate for this moment. When asked where the makeup was, the lady, with a slight expression of irritation, stated that the makeup made the skin look older, and in her opinion, it was completely inappropriate for the occasion, despite all its popularity among other ladies. After which, the noblewoman, with a playful expression on her face, asked whether her husband didn't like the new look, with a slight smile, as if checking his reaction and hoping for approval. Turning away, Fervin said with obvious bewilderment that the beauty's behavior seemed strange to him, as if she was deliberately trying to make him feel awkward, despite her impeccable appearance and calm. The thing was that the guy, feeling awkward, tried to hide the blush that suddenly appeared on his face, trying to keep his emotions under control, so as not to reveal his inner embarrassment. Finally, the long-awaited moment arrived, and a delicious meal was served to the table. An incredible steak with melting butter and carefully selected spices, beautifully presented on a plate beckoning with its aroma. Like a true aristocrat, Fervin took the knife in his hand with refined grace and began to carefully cut the dish, giving special importance to each movement as if it were part of an exquisite ritual. However, noticing a strange look directed in his direction, the husband could not contain his curiosity, and closing his eyes in excitement, asked why she was behaving so unusually, as if she was hiding something important. The upset lady, with an uncertain expression on her face, stretched out the answer that she was just trying to improve her relationship with her husband since their quarrels had become frequent, and she was looking for a way to bring peace back into their relationship, not knowing how to act correctly. The man answered rudely that he had long ago learned by heart all the women's tricks, and now he was no longer going to fall for her deceptive smiles, which could no longer deceive him despite her external attractiveness and gentleness. Jumping up from her seat, Irvin retorted sharply, claiming that she was merely trying to fulfill her marital duties, and nothing more, not wanting her actions to be construed as anything more than caring for her family. Covering his face in embarrassment, Fervin looked away, falling silent, which caused confusion in his wife, who, not understanding the reasons for his silence, began to worry even more and think about what could have happened. After a long silence, the man finally decided to explain that the maiden's duty, like his own, was not only to take care of the house, but also to conceive a child to ensure the future of her family and continue the lineage. A tense silence fell between the young couple in the spacious dining room, where many dishes were laid out on the table, and each of them did not know how to properly continue the conversation in which there were so many unexpressed emotions. The lady opened her mouth in surprise, not expecting to hear such a frank and sharp answer, which, like a bolt from the blue, plunged her into confusion, forcing her to think about the reasons for his persistence. In the novel, all the ladies admired the appearance of the emperor's younger brother, who had refined facial features and white hair, which gave him a mysterious and almost mystical appearance, causing admiration and respect. However, no one could resist a more handsome man, namely the Duke, whose attractiveness and refined posture captivated the hearts of many ladies, making them dream of intimacy with him. It is the maiden who gives birth to this nobleman's child, who will be able to earn a place next to him, forever sharing his fate and privileges, becoming his equal and worthy companion in life. The guy looked at his wife attentively, waiting for her answer, hoping that she would find the strength to say what he had been waiting for so long and decide what to do in this difficult situation. The girl clutched the hem of her dress with her fingers, trying to hide her nervous tension, feeling her heart beat faster, and every word said at this moment could change her life forever. Without waiting for an answer, the Duke stood up from his seat, his man's face distorted with disappointment and bewilderment, When he realized that his wife, for some reason, did not want to spend their wedding night with him, which seemed completely unnatural and offensive to him. As he passed the lady, the man holding back his indignation asked her to forget everything that had been said earlier, as if he was trying to erase the traces of his disappointment and unpleasant words that could darken their future. However, when Irvin couldn't bear it any longer and jumped up from her seat to object, Fervin, standing at the door, coldly ordered her to sit back down, demonstrating his authority and determination not to let the woman argue with him at that moment. When he ordered her to continue eating, Irvin, without hiding her indignation, cried out that her husband had put her in an awkward position, using her weaknesses in order to then run away without even giving her a chance to express her feelings. The Duke was deeply outraged by this, and without hiding his anger, he sternly ordered the maiden to behave as before, not to dare stick her nose out, and not to meddle with her comments in his affairs, as if her opinion was unimportant to him. The guy's green eyes, in which rage sparkled, radiated such strength and determination that any word or movement would seem like a mistake, and his gaze was so piercing that it seemed like it could burn everything around him. Fearing his authority and anger, the lady instantly shut up, unable to utter a word, feeling her voice getting lost in her throat and her heart constricting from helplessness and fear of this man. Before leaving, Fervin, without turning around, ordered his wife not to catch his eye again, as if her presence was a heavy burden for him, and he did not even want to meet her gaze. The chicken on the table remained untouched, and the other dishes, although exquisitely prepared, did not find their taste that evening, remaining forgotten and cold, like the entire atmosphere around. Irvin, left alone in the large room, sat at the table, surrounded by emptiness, and finding no comfort in her surroundings, struggled to cope with her loneliness, slowly eating her food as if each piece was a painful reminder of what she had experienced. As the lady ate her fried chicken leg, she couldn't understand what the former Irvin had done that made the Duke hate her so much, as if their entire journey together had had no meaning, and her efforts had left no trace. Suddenly, another person appeared behind her, which startled the lady, causing her heart to skip a few beats. The unexpected visit was so unexpected that she could not immediately pull herself together, but someone quietly told her not to worry so much. It was Madame Tilly, who seemed to be untroubled by anything, looking at her mistress with a kind and welcoming smile, as if her appearance was supposed to dispel all worries and restore a sense of calm to this tense moment. Sadly, hanging her head, the girl told the maid everything about her cold husband, about how her heart was filled with pain from his indifference, and how hard it was for her to understand that he no longer saw in her the woman he had loved before. The older woman, after listening carefully, explained that her husband needed time to understand that his wife had changed, and to realize that dreams and expectations were finally beginning to come true, even if it seemed too incredible to him. The thing was that the man who lived by strict principles and constantly expected changes was too tired from long years of waiting, and now faced with this new reality, it was difficult for him to believe that dreams had finally become reality. In a cozy gazebo located in the very heart of the garden, two ladies comfortably settled down, enjoying the silence and beauty of the surrounding nature. One of the ladies, truly charming, gracefully lifted a cup of tea, carefully taking it from the tray, and elegantly took the first sip, enjoying the aroma of the drink and the atmosphere of peace. Irvin, absorbed in the moment, continued to enjoy her tea in the fresh air, peacefully chatting in the company of the lady, and enjoying her company, which brought true pleasure and joy. With a warm smile on her face, the noblewoman expressed her gratitude to the maid for her care during the difficult moments of her cold, noting how important it was for her to receive attention and help, which she always received without feeling lonely. Teely stood frozen in shock, her eyes incredibly wide in surprise, but she quickly pulled herself together, and a small smile appeared on her lips as she took hold of her teacup again. The maid, sensing the change in mood, smiled reservedly, and her hands confidently held the cup of tea as if nothing had happened, and she continued to carefully serve her mistress, not paying attention to her emotions. The ladies were discussing the upcoming event, a reception at the emperor's younger brother's, which was to take place at his residence. It was there that a great festival was planned, which promised to be grand and significant for the entire court. The tea she held in her hands was incredibly aromatic, its scent filling the room, and evoking feelings of comfort and calm, like a soft, warm wind caressing the skin on a cold winter evening. The lady enjoying this hot drink listened attentively to the story of how she had previously refused to participate in an important cultural event, as a result of which her place at the ball was taken by the famous Marquise Celestine, who accepted her invitation. Such a cultural festival usually attracted only the most high-flown aristocrats to spend time in refined conversations and enjoy the arts, demonstrating their status in society through participation in such a significant event. However, despite the appearance of cultural communication behind this mask of noble manners and high-flown conversations, there was hidden a cruel and no less serious competition between the nobles. They all sought to demonstrate their wealth. All the ladies dressed in luxurious outfits, decorated with precious stones and rare fabrics, not only expressed their impeccable taste, but also thus emphasized their high social status, indicating how important external attributes are for them in society. Irvin, raising her hand to her chest with exquisite grace, asked the maid with slight excitement whether she could, despite all the warnings, join the cultural festival, since her soul was drawn to this event full of music and art. With a smile that seemed to melt the ice, the beauty proudly declared that she had long dreamed of performing one special song, and for this, she simply had to hire the best orchestra so that everything would go perfectly. When Teely suggested that she also involve a choir, the girl gently but firmly refused, confidently, saying that her voice alone was quite capable of conveying the full depth and power of the piece, and she did not need the help of other singers. To finally dispel Tilly's doubts, the beauty straightened her chest and, opening her mouth, began to sing. Her voice, pure and gentle, easily wrapped itself around the space, filling the room with such beauty that everyone present was literally enchanted. The mansion she was in was majestic and expensive. It stood as a symbol of wealth and taste, inspiring respect in all who dared to visit it, and reminding of its owner, a man of impeccable status. The servants, who were so busy with their daily duties, stopped their steps in surprise, as if unable to ignore this beautiful singing coming from afar, and for a moment forgot their worries, delighted by the exciting sounds. The maids, slowing their steps, stopped at the window, pointing with their fingers towards the gazebo from which the enchanting voice was coming, and their gaze was involuntarily riveted to this place, as if they themselves could not help but be imbued with the magic of the moment. In a garden surrounded by greenery and flowers, a beautiful lady standing in the shade of the trees gracefully extended her hand forward, as if inviting everyone to listen, and her voice, filling the space, seemed so pure and magical that the hearts carried away by it involuntarily stopped. Teely, standing next to him, pressed her hands to her face, her eyes wide with surprise and delight. She could not believe her ears, because she had never heard such a powerful and beautiful performance before, which seemed to penetrate into the very soul. The woman, shocked by the amazing and undeservedly hidden talent that her mistress had concealed, stood in amazement, unable to believe that this singing had come from her. And this discovery seemed to turn her idea of her mistress upside down. Irvin was genuinely pleased that her singing was finally appreciated, and this brought her not only inner satisfaction, but also confidence that her talent was recognized, even in this world, where so often only the external is valued. Teely's niece, with genuine curiosity and joy, asked her hostess if it was true that she was going to take part in the upcoming cultural evening, anticipating this event and hoping to see her aunt in the center of attention. The girl, slightly embarrassed, answered the maid that in fact she had not changed her character as much as it might seem at first glance, despite all the changes that had occurred in her life and on her path to self-development. The beauty sat on the stairs, lost in thoughts about her husband, his attitude towards her, and his opinion of her actions, and her gaze stopped every now and then at the door, as if expecting some sign or arrival. She looked at the door, wondering when her lover would finally come, and in her soul an unquenchable expectation was growing, which filled her, making her heart beat faster in anticipation of his return. The beauty, opening her eyes, felt how, with a light sigh, she involuntarily dozed off, and only after some time she woke up feeling how the gentle sleep left a pleasant ambiguity in her mind. But her consciousness again returned to reality. Sitting up in bed, covering herself with a soft blanket, she tried to collect her thoughts, When she noticed that the maid was standing next to her, as if expecting something, her gaze was full of concern, and there was something alarming in this silence. Teely, with a slight nod, greeted her mistress, then, with genuine concern, expressed her concern for her mistress's health, making sure that she was okay, but her eyes betrayed her anxiety, for she was well aware that Irvin was still feeling weak. With sadness in her eyes, the girl quietly asked, turning her gaze to her mistress, did her husband really hate Irvin, because she had heard so much about it, but she herself could not find an explanation for these strange and sometimes painful feelings that he showed. With doubt and a slight feeling of pain, she continued to speak as if she were looking for confirmation of her experiences, because the thought that her lover could feel such deep hatred for Irvin did not give her peace and sometimes tormented her soul. A smile appeared on the maid's face as she suddenly realized that despite all the differences and difficulties, she was an important part of this world. After all, how could a husband carry his wife to bed if he did not love her sincerely and deeply? Irvin was truly shocked by such an answer. She did not expect at all that it would be Fervin, who always seemed so strict and cold to her, who would be the one to take her in his arms and carry her to bed with such care and tenderness. The guy could not remain indifferent to his lady, because his heart was full of care for her. He carefully picked her up in his arms, and not wanting to cause her the slightest discomfort, carried her to the bedroom, confident that this was his duty and his desire. Pressing the torn blanket to her body, the girl could not understand why the man who treated her so caringly and tenderly behind closed doors sometimes said such rude and cold words to her face, unlike his actions. Night, like a dark blanket, quietly descended upon the earth, and outside the window, in the mysterious light of dim street lamps, the doors looked like those in an old fairy tale, ready to welcome guests on their festive threshold. Stacks of books lay on the old wooden table, their pages carelessly turned over, and the smell of ancient tomes filled the air, as if inviting one to immerse oneself in a world of forgotten stories and deep thoughts. Two men sat at this table. Both of them seemed absorbed in their thoughts, but there was a weariness in their eyes, as if they could not find a way to harmony in this protracted evening. One of the men's fingers tapped irritably on the tabletop, creating a monotonous sound that echoed throughout the room, and his gaze was directed somewhere into the distance, where apparently the reason for this boredom and impatience was hidden. The Duke sat at his desk, writing intently, his pen gliding across the paper, leaving behind subtle traces, as if each stroke were part of a long and important process in which he was completely immersed. Opposite him, surrounded by the soft light of candles, sat the Emperor himself, the handsome Caesar Pledine, who looked at his friend with a benevolent smile and with genuine interest asked about his wife and her strange behavior, as if trying to solve a riddle. The Duke's face showed no emotion. His gaze remained motionless, and the silence only increased the tension in the air, for his reactions were a mystery to all who tried to read his inner world. Fervin, wary of jumping to conclusions, could not help but notice how often the maids in whispers and with curiosity discussed his wife behind his back, as if every remark they made was part of some hidden performance in which he did not know his role. The Emperor, noticing Fervin's silence again, turned to his friend and asked him if he had noticed how much Irvin had changed since her illness. He said that her behavior had become truly strange and uncharacteristic. Caesar, with a slight smile that barely concealed his curiosity, turned again to Fervin, jokingly asking if it was not worthwhile to now call his beautiful wife "sweet lady" and not "evil bitch," as he had done before when her character left much to be desired. A gold ring glittered on Fervin's finger, symbolizing his vow of fidelity and devotion in marriage. This small but meaningful accessory was a reminder of the important commitment he had made, despite everything that was happening in their lives. Fervin was lost in thought about how his wife Irvin had really changed. He noticed that her demeanor had become more closed, her gaze more distant, and her words less likely to sound with that old fire. Irvin began to smile more often, and her behavior changed noticeably. She became calm and peaceful, as if regaining the inner harmony that she had previously lacked. The man was deeply moved when he saw his wife sitting on the steps, peacefully falling asleep, while waiting for his return. The moment was touching, for she was not her usual alert or fidgety self, but simply sat absorbed in the silence. When the girl fell asleep, her behavior became even more charming. She involuntarily pursed her lips, giving her appearance a special charm, as if continuing some unconscious game with the world. Fervin clutched his head, unable to shake the feeling that he was faced with a new kind of sophisticated mockery that only this charming but ruthless beauty could come up with. Caesar couldn't help but laugh as he watched his usually unflappable and confident friend suddenly become so embarrassed that he didn't know where to hide his eyes or how to hide his confusion. Fervin first met his future wife on a bright sunny day, when the palace walls were surrounded by many guards, and the atmosphere seemed filled with solemnity and tension. At that moment, the Duke, dressed in his slightly funny and uncomfortable uniform, could not take his eyes off the girl, who, as it seemed to him by her mere presence, made the whole world around him brighter and more significant. Surrounded by the Emperor, the man confidently walked along the long corridors of the palace, conducting a lively conversation on important topics, which, judging by his serious tone, concerned both state and personal affairs. Caesar, just one step ahead, with a slight smile on his face, spoke of his decision to come to the upcoming festival, accompanied by the Empress, which caused him to become noticeably excited. Fervin could barely hide his displeasure and confusion, since the news that his wife was also going to attend the event did not please him at all, because he knew very well how rude and unrestrained she could be in society. Caesar stopped his indignant friend gently but firmly, reminding him that Irvin was obliged to appear at the celebration, since her presence was not only important, but also an expected event in the eyes of all the courtiers. The nobleman, in a state of complete shock, froze in place upon hearing the news that Irvin, whose behavior had often caused bewilderment, was going to perform with the orchestra, which seemed completely unexpected to everyone present. The graceful, handsome man bowed his head in a show of respect before the ruler, who noted with a slight smile that it seemed that even random strangers knew more about the intentions of the nobleman's wife than he did. However, from Irvin, known for her cruel nature, whose face was hidden behind an exquisite fan, one could expect the most unexpected actions, because she always knew how to amaze those around her with her unpredictability. The Emperor, in an attempt to support his friend, put his arm around his shoulders in a friendly manner, demonstrating his sincere willingness to share and ease the Duke's worries in such an ambiguous situation. Caesar, trying to encourage his friend, advised the Duke to perceive such changes in his wife's character as an opportunity for her growth and transformation, and to hope that over time everything would get better. After a short pause, Caesar, with a slight smile, remarked that it would be wonderful if their union produced offspring, since a child possessing the blood of two great families would become a symbol of their unification. The Duke, his head down, his gaze empty and clouded, was lost in the memories of the words of his advisers, who reminded him that his marriage was merely a political agreement, not implying deep feelings. However, looking at the gold ring sparkling on his finger, he felt a strange contradictory feeling. The symbol of their union seemed to him at the same time a heavy burden and an unclear hope. The loud voices of the two guards echoed down the hallway as they proudly announced to their mistress that all preparations for the important event had been completed on time and in compliance with all requirements. Irvin, fixing her stern gaze on the guards, suddenly softly remarked that they had done a really good job, and her words sounded like a sincere compliment, which was not at all usual for her. With a slight smile on her face, the lady praised the men, noting their hard work and dedication to the cause, which immediately caused genuine confusion and pleasant surprise among the guards. The guards flushed, and with confused smiles, stood motionless, as if rooted to the spot, stunned by the unexpected praise, which they did not expect to hear from the lips of their mistress. As they left the closed doors with joyful excitement, they discussed Irvin heatedly, marveling at how much their lady had changed, turning from cold and stern to good-natured and attentive to those around her. A happy smile flashed through the massive doors, belonging to someone who seemed to be completely immersed in her thoughts and in anticipation of the upcoming event, which promised to be grandiose. An elegant hand glided easily across the paper, writing lines of writing, in which each letter seemed filled with a certain mystery and emotional trepidation. Having stopped writing, the beauty thought for a moment, realizing that there were only 3 days left until the important event, and came to the conclusion that preparation for such a significant event required even more attention and concentration. Thoughts of waiting for the emperor and empress at the celebration took over her mind, increasing her desire for everything to go perfectly as their presence added grandeur and significance to the event. Irvin decided that it was time to demonstrate to those around her the changes that had taken place in her character, replacing her former formidable severity with a refined sweetness and benevolence that she now tried to embody. A graceful hand rose with a slight movement and knocked on the carved wooden door, signaling that the lady was waiting to be met and was ready for further instructions or news. The maid, bowing her head with respect and reverence, informed her mistress that the new dress ordered especially for her, sewn according to all her requirements, had finally arrived in the chambers. Teely, the maid, offered to try on the magnificent dress without delay to make sure it fit perfectly, and the lady happily agreed, seeing it as a step towards her impeccable preparation. The dress turned out to be a real work of art, exquisitely sewn from soft, iridescent fabric of a delicate blue hue, decorated with precious stones that seemed to shine like heavenly stars. Irvin felt a little embarrassed, and even a little awkward, that she couldn't put on such an exquisite dress without the help of the maids, despite her independence and confidence. Once behind the screen, she peered out cautiously from time to time to see how the outfit transformed her image, and she could hardly contain her curiosity about how the dress would highlight her graceful figure. Suddenly, the lady stopped, as if enchanted by her reflection, carefully examining how perfectly the dress emphasized her silhouette and grace, which caused her an involuntary feeling of pride. Unable to hide her delight, the lady began to slowly turn in front of the mirror, taking graceful poses as if admiring not only the beautiful dress, but also the thinness of her waist, which looked flawless. A sudden noise outside the door caught her attention, but caught up in her reflection, she only briefly thought that it could be Teely going about her daily duties. The door opened slightly, and a man stepped inside, but the lady, completely absorbed in her image in the mirror, did not notice that there was already someone else in the room. Irvin decided that it was probably the maid who had come in to help with the finishing touches, but behind her stood the towering figure of a man whose presence had so far gone unnoticed. A feeling of awkwardness came over Irvin as her gaze in the mirror suddenly stopped on the reflection of the Duke, who stood nearby watching her, with an imperturbable and almost impassive expression on his face. Confused, she turned around abruptly, her breathing caught for a moment, and surprise flashed in her eyes, mixed with a slight hint of shame for being caught in such an informal setting. Her husband Fervin stood before her, reserved and silent, but still his appearance made Irvin feel vulnerable, because he seemed to have time to see her admiration for himself. Fervin, looking down to avoid awkwardness, quietly, and almost apologetically, asked his wife to give him some time for an important conversation that seemed to be difficult for him. The Duke held a snow-white sheet in his hand, and despite its lightness, he seemed imperious and imposing, towering over his wife, like a figure full of determination and calm strength. Suddenly, realizing that she was standing before her husband in a light nightgown that barely concealed her figure, Lady Irvin felt acute embarrassment. Her bare feet, not covered by fabric, seemed vulnerable and deprived of any protection. Blushing with embarrassment, she turned around abruptly, unable to contain her feelings. And unable to contain the wave of emotions, she screamed in order to somehow hide her inner discomfort. Annoyed and indignant, she could not help but express her displeasure, accusing Fervin of calmly looking at her naked body without feeling even the slightest shame or embarrassment. Obediently turning away, the boy, feeling the weight of the silence, said with nervousness in his voice that no significant events had been held at the Carline estate for a long time, and the atmosphere was too calm for such events. After these words, he fell silent, his face distorted with embarrassment, not knowing how to continue the conversation, trying to find the right words, but not feeling confident in what he said. The man's hand, nervously touching the collar of his uniform, visibly tightened as a cold sweat ran down his neck, indicating the tension he was trying to hide. The girl, feeling awkward, became embarrassed when her gaze accidentally caught the moment when the guy began to undress, which was completely out of her expectations, and left her confused. The husband, leaning over his wife with obvious concern in his voice, asked why she had behaved so strangely before, and what had caused her behavior to change, moving to some completely different better side. Irvin, waving her arms in front of her, barely holding back her emotions, loudly declared that her husband's words were complete nonsense and had no logic behind them, and that indignation was clearly evident in every word she spoke. However, upon hearing such words, the Duke did not calm down, but on the contrary, his face was distorted with anger. He felt his irritation growing with every second, and he could not remain calm. Putting his hand to his face, the guy groaned heavily, expressing complete bewilderment, because he could not understand either the purpose or the nature of the changes that had occurred with his beloved, which only increased his internal pain and disappointment. With tension in her voice and a hint of malice on her lips, the beauty reminded her husband that now, despite everything that was happening, she was going to fulfill all her marital duties, and her words sounded like a challenge. Slowly and with obvious tension in her body, she looked towards the bed where the sheet lay, intending to cover herself, but her movements were full of some hidden anxiety, as if she was not entirely sure of her decision. Suddenly, as she stepped forward, her foot caught on some object lying on the floor, and at that moment the woman's foot tripped, causing an instant imbalance that put her in a dangerous position. The Duke, noticing his wife begin to lose her balance and fall, reacted instantly, reaching out his hand towards her to catch her and prevent the noblewoman from falling onto the hard surface of the floor, causing his face to distort with alarm. The aristocrat, feeling her body losing its balance, closed her eyes in fear, preparing to fall. Her fragile heart was pounding hard, and she literally felt how everything around her began to blur, leaving only panic. However, when she decided to open her eyes to understand what was happening to her, she met the gaze of her husband, who was incredibly close, and at that moment it seemed to her that the world around them disappeared, leaving only this moment. Once on the bed, they lay together, but the situation was far from calm. The aristocrat found herself on a soft blanket, while her husband, who had unexpectedly appeared on top of her, lay above her as if protecting her. Frowning and clearly indignant, the lady began to loudly object, pointing out the Duke's strange preferences, who in her opinion did not like her without makeup, considering her less attractive, and also reproached her for not fulfilling her marital duty properly. Suddenly, with unexpected determination, the guy grabbed her hand, which was waving it in the air in anger, trying to express her indignation, and at that moment, the tension in the room became literally palpable. Irvin found herself pinned to the bed by her own husband, and despite her feminine resistance, she felt the man's body collapsing on her, taking complete control of the situation. Disheveled, and finally realizing the depth of their differences, the Duke regretfully admitted that if he continued to behave as before, the lady would begin to avoid him even more, and this would be absolutely natural. The boy had a strange expression on his face, completely at odds with what one would expect from a man who claimed to hate his wife, but his eyes betrayed more than just cold contempt. Irvin, trying to justify herself, somehow said loudly that in fact she just wanted to improve her relationship with her husband, sincerely hoping that her words could somehow change the atmosphere between them. Her gaze, unconsciously sliding over the nobleman's collarbones, lingered on his strong, muscular body, which seemed completely timeless. But at some point, this realization made her feel uncomfortable. Turning away shyly, she hurried to remove her eyes, unable to continue looking at the man who was so attractive, but at the same time seemed too distant and unattainable for her. Suddenly, the guy began to approach the lady, slowly lowering his head, as if trying to hide his intentions, but his movements were full of some kind of tense confidence that left no room for doubt. Fervin was so close to Irvin that their faces were almost touching, and his breath was felt on her neck, which made her heart beat faster, as if there was an invisible spark between them, ready to flare up at any moment. With his lips barely touching her skin, he almost pressed himself against her, as if wanting to give her the long-awaited caress, and his touches, despite their tenderness, were permeated with some hidden passion that was difficult not to feel. The man's hand held the woman's tightly, not allowing her to break free, and at that moment, Irvin felt not only the strength of his grip, but also something more, the confidence with which he led her, as if trying to keep her in his world. Grabbing the guy's collar with her fingers, the girl shyly but firmly asked him to stop. Her voice itself was soft, but there was a firmness in it that she could barely hide, trying to regain control of the situation. With effort but determination, She pushed him away from her, ordering him to restore his own decency, and the words were like an order that she could not allow herself not to pronounce, despite everything that was happening between them. The girl's face was truly charming. The woman's eyes were full of fear and anger, but at the moment when the fragile fingers slid over his clothes, the man's fingers could not stand it and barely touched his lips, which left both confused. The faces of the young couple were incredibly close. Their breaths mingled, and despite all the contradictions and misunderstandings, an invisible connection arose between them that was difficult to ignore. Their lips were just millimeters apart, and in that moment it seemed as if time stood still, as if the world around them had disappeared, leaving only this one tense moment that could change everything. However, without giving himself time to think, Fervin abruptly retreated, moving away from her, and with a roughness in his voice, said that he always thought that a lady performed her marital duties only out of duty and not out of true desire. Despite the anger that was on his face, it was impossible not to notice how his eyes were trembling, as if hiding the deepest fear and insecurity that pierced his inner world, causing him to behave so cruelly and alienated. The Duke, despite all the tension of the situation, resolutely refused to get up from the girl until they had a frank conversation, and he had heard the truth from her, because in his eyes at that moment there was too much that was unsaid. The aristocrat, already tired of endless attempts to explain, once again reminded her husband that she was only trying to improve the relationship and bring harmony back to their married life, hoping for sincerity on both sides. The man, however, did not believe her words, and feeling the growing tension, Irvin had no choice but to forcefully push him away with her hands in order to regain at least some control over the situation. But despite her intentions at the moment, when she tried to free herself, her hands accidentally pulled the guy's unbuttoned uniform, and his naked body briefly appeared from under the fabric, which left no room for further words. The lady felt very embarrassed, and a deep blush came into her cheeks, which she could not conceal despite all her efforts. Her face became as bright as scarlet roses, and every glance seemed to her to reveal all her feelings. Playfully, with a slight grin, the guy teased his wife, insisting that she repeat her previous words, as if checking whether her confidence and honesty would change at this moment, which did not seem so serious. The girl, despite her embarrassment, continued to firmly insist that she had not lied to her husband and had not set up any tricks. Her voice sounded confident that the truth would come out anyway. The Duke couldn't help but grin and laugh, making fun of how easily and carefree she spoke about everything, as if each of her answers was a simple game that had no serious consequences. Coldly, and without the slightest embarrassment, Fervin stated that the beauty had previously deceived him, committing a terrible act. She got rid of the child who could have become part of his family, and now he could not help but feel betrayed. The lady, unable to believe her ears, could hardly comprehend what had just been said to her. Asking about the past, she tried to find at least some truth, but it seemed to her that Irvin could not have concealed such a grave crime. The nobleman, still sitting on top of the lady, said bitterly and irritably that it was impossible to change so quickly in such a short period of time. He desperately did not believe a single word of his wife, despite her words and confidence. He screamed in rage, unable to contain himself any longer, asking if she really thought that, after all these years of lies, he could forgive her so easily, forgetting all her betrayals and infidelities. His words were filled with despair. The noblewoman, in turn, tried to deny his accusations, claiming that she had never tried to manipulate him or strengthen her power at his expense. She tried to explain that her actions had no hidden intentions, although everything seemed to be destroyed inside. But suddenly, under the weight of his words and accusations, the lady could not hold back, and unable to hold back her tears, she began to cry, her face distorted with pain and regret. And at that moment, she realized how much her relationship with him was lost. She suddenly remembered her past life, when full of dreams, she tried to become a singer. But all her hopes collapsed, and death came unexpectedly, cutting off her dreams and destroying everything she had strived for. However, Irvin could not understand why, having been reborn in this new world, she became the main villain, and not the sweet heroine as she always dreamed, struggling with her own doubts and internal conflict that did not give her peace. The Duke jumped up suddenly, unable to bear the tension, and instantly stood up from his wife when he noticed her tears. his face distorted with incomprehension, and he stepped aside to at least hide a little from this pain that overwhelmed him. The girl, feeling that the actions only aggravated the suffering, could not stand it, and with anger in her voice, shouted at her husband, not understanding how he could react like that. An attempt to explain only made him even more vulnerable, and he stuttered. Suddenly, a snow-white handkerchief appeared in front of the noblewoman's face as a sign of his apology, but at that moment, everything seemed too late, and he only reminded her of how everything could have been different if they had both acted differently. Turning away, Fervin, noticing how his wife continued to hold back her tears, asked her to wipe her face in a restrained manner, without unnecessary emotion, because in his opinion, tears would not help resolve the situation, but would only aggravate her pain. While the lady, confused and lost in her emotions, wiped her wet face, the man tried to calm her down, trying to convey to her the idea that crying won't help matters, and that she needs to think about a way out of the situation rationally. But despite his cold and cruel words, Irvin couldn't help but cry even harder, feeling the pain of his accusations penetrate her soul, undermining everything she considered important in their relationship. The man's fingers squeezing her hand were in some way an attempt to support her, but they only added heaviness to her heart, making her feel like she was losing more and more connection with what had once been important to her in this union. Irvin, holding back her rage and despair, asked rudely what exactly he was going to do, not believing her ears from such treatment, and not understanding whether he was experiencing some kind of sadistic pleasure over her, or whether this was simply his cruel truth. The Duke's fingers slowly rose upward, as if he was trying to take the blame for what was happening, trying to gain control in this difficult moment that was tormenting them both. But to Irvin's surprise, he suddenly began to gently, almost tenderly, wipe the moisture from her cheeks, acting so carefully as if he wanted to atone for his cruelty, trying to make amends for his guilt before her, despite her despair. After this, he stood up awkwardly. His movements became abrupt, his face flushed with awkwardness, and he turned his back to his wife as if trying to hide from her gaze, hiding his own feelings that he did not know how to express. Frowning and feeling the tension between them growing, he, still not understanding what was going on, made a firm decision and asked her to explain if there really was some misunderstanding between them. Irvin, sitting in front of him, couldn't help but stare blankly, as if she hadn't heard his words. Her face was covered in worry, and her hands were folded helplessly on her knees, as if she had already lost all hope of understanding from him. The aristocrat, clasping her hands on her knees, sat in tense silence, as if trying to contain all the emotions that were seething inside her, not knowing how to continue the conversation with her husband. Fervin, sitting luxuriously in his chair, listened with his mouth open attentively to the words of his wife, who was overcome with regret about her past and bad behavior. He did not know how to react to the confessions, because these words only confirmed painful suspicions. The girl, unable to contain her wave of emotions, suddenly shouted that she did not want a child from him at all, but only sought to strengthen her power, which became for her a way to maintain control in this marriage, which she initially perceived as a political union. Wiping away tears, the beauty bowed her head and quietly said that over the next year she would behave with dignity and try to do everything to regain his trust. And after everything was over, their paths would diverge. The man did not say a word when the lady declared that he would undoubtedly find himself a new worthy match, because her words did not arouse in him the slightest desire to enter into an argument, although emotions raged inside him. As Fervin headed for the exit, he added without turning around that despite everything that had happened, he still respected his wife's opinion and was not going to ignore her words, no matter how bitter it was for him to hear them. Irvin was left alone in the room, sitting on the bed in complete silence, absorbed in her thoughts, feeling how every moment without her husband broke her heart even more because she no longer knew what to do next. The wind coming through the open window lifted her hair into the air as if trying to tear it out of her soul, and the girl, no longer able to hold herself back, fell helplessly onto the bed, feeling how her body was losing its last strength, consumed by despair. As she continued to sob, Irvin thought about what sin she had committed in her past life, that she had been reborn in the body of a villain again, and why fate was dealing with her so cruelly, causing her to experience pain and disappointment. Fervin himself, standing in the doorway, froze, pressing his hand to his face, as if trying to hide his thoughts from her, not knowing what to say and how to ease her suffering, which as a husband also could not leave him indifferent. He stood motionless, biting his finger, unable to believe that the girl he considered cruel and cold could worry so much, suffer so deeply, like an ordinary person, something he never expected from his wife. It was strange, and even painful, to see such a cruel and fearless maiden crying, and her tears sparkling, like precious stones, reflected all her internal struggle that was destroying her from within. Teely, frozen in place and pressed against the wall, became wary when she saw the gentleman at the door of her mistress's chambers, not knowing how to behave and what to do now, because everything in this moment was so tense and strange. Bowing her head in respect, and standing next to him, the woman carefully asked if the man had given his wife the dress she had been waiting for, holding back a wave of anxiety so as not to show unnecessary curiosity. The guy was clearly dissatisfied with the words of the maid, who with such naive expectation hoped that there was still some spark between the young couple that could flare up into feelings. But this seemed frivolous and inappropriate to him at the moment. Fervin looked down and thoughtfully asked the maid, suddenly wondering what the crying of the woman standing in front of him really meant, because in his understanding, tears had a completely different meaning than the pain he himself was experiencing. Teely, frozen in surprise, could not believe her ears, not expecting that the man would show such interest in this matter, because before he had never paid attention to such things, considering them a manifestation of weakness or unnecessary sentimentality. After a short pause, trying not to show her anxiety, she nevertheless tried to explain that people as a rule begin to cry when they feel sad, when they are overwhelmed with emotions, and that this is a natural reaction to internal pain and despair. Suddenly, the servant realized that the mistress had begun to cry, and in horror she put her hands to her face, not knowing what to do, how to calm her down, because such scenes were rare, and they always filled her heart with anxiety. Without delay, not a minute, Teely, jumping up from her seat, burst into her mistress's chambers, anxiously asking her about her health, trying to understand what could have caused such pain, and why her always reserved mistress was on the verge of tears. The door slammed shut, leaving Teely and her owner alone, creating an atmosphere filled with tension, as if the space itself sensed the tension of what was happening. Fervin, unable to contain himself, put his ear to the door, listening to the conversation between the two women, trying to understand what was really going on. What had brought his wife to such a state, and why her emotions had become so heightened. It was only when he heard the lady begin to stop sobbing again, quietly sniffling, that he finally calmed down, realizing that she seemed to have found the strength to pull herself together, although the pain and suffering remained deep inside. The Duke gritted his teeth as he suddenly realized that doubts and even pity for his wife had appeared in his soul, as if the cruelty he had once shown her had begun to dissolve under the influence of her tears and pain. Unable to resist, Fervin walked up to her and as if unconsciously began to wipe away his tears, feeling his heart increasingly filled with an incomprehensible feeling that he could not explain to himself, but it was too strong to ignore. Walking down the corridor, Fervin fell into deep thought, feeling a strange sensation come over him, as if he had come across some important and uncomfortable discovery that could not be simply forgotten while holding his head in his hands. A long and destructive conflict continued between the Empire and the Duchy of Verma. The fires of war engulfed cities, turning them into ashes, and the inhabitants suffered from destruction that undermined the foundations of their peaceful life. Eventually, after much negotiation and disagreement, both sides came to a decision, entering into an important alliance that was formalized in the form of a marriage contract, which became the key to restoring peace and stability between the two states. It was then, at that fateful moment, that the man first met Irven, a mysterious beauty with bright red lips, whose eyes radiated coldness and determination, as if she knew no fear and did not need anyone's protection. He froze, looking down in embarrassment, his cheeks flushed with awkwardness, and although he tried to maintain his composure, his eyes reflected his dissatisfaction at not being able to express his feelings. There was a wedding between them, but it was nothing more than a formality, without any spark, without passion, without love, like two strangers forced to link their destinies by force of circumstances. When the lady holding back her emotions moved to the empire, she did not utter a word, but only silently sat on a chair as if fencing herself off from the outside world, absorbed in her thoughts and inner world. The lady was dressed in a morning black dress, which emphasized her alienation from all the events happening around her. Her actions and behavior were cold and distant, as if she did not belong to this world. There was anger in her blue eyes, and there was rage and malice hidden in her gaze, as if she was trying to radiate strength to protect herself from what was hurting her. Although there were confused feelings hidden behind the external cold-bloodedness, she often humiliated her husband by uttering harsh and caustic words that hurt him more than once, causing him to suffer from her cold reproaches and cruelty, which left deep wounds in his heart. This became a real disappointment for the young aristocrat, who still hoped for a change, but instead only encountered misunderstanding and alienation, which destroyed his dreams of a happy marriage. The noblewoman, dressed in a white dress with white gloves and pearl jewelry, radiated elegance, but her face, despite the exquisite outfit, did not express either joy or inner peace, only a cold mask hiding true feelings. The woman's hands were raised in the air, ready to make a graceful gesture that was not just a movement, but a preparation for something important. Perhaps the execution of some gesture or action that was supposed to complete her idea. Teely's niece and the other young man cautiously admired their mistress's voice, watching her performance, not daring to say anything unnecessary, but seeing in her performance some kind of extraordinary power and magic. They rejoiced at their mistress's talent, admiring the way she masterfully used her voice, bringing to each note not only technique, but also emotion that could touch the soul of anyone who listened to hers. With joy and gratitude, the lady thanked everyone present for their attention and support. Her words were full of appreciation, and she sincerely appreciated their participation in her life and her successes. In her past life, the girl spent a lot of time behind the microphone, perfecting her skills, working on every chord and every word, striving to become a true master that no one could forget. Suddenly, Mrs. Tilly entered the room, greeting everyone present with a polite bow, and addressing the hostess of the house. Her demeanor was reserved and respectful, but at the same time full of inner strength and confidence. Bowing her head in respect, the lady announced that, at that moment, the emperor himself had arrived at the house, as well as other important nobles, whose presence gave special significance to this event, preparing everyone for an important conversation or conclusion of a deal. The lady's face changed dramatically. Signs of tension appeared on its surface, and sweat ran down her skin, indicating the experiences and inner anxiety that gripped her at that moment. Looking at her reflection in the mirror, Irvin made a firm decision that at this moment she could not afford to make the slightest mistake, since her reputation and self-confidence were at stake. This day was her most important debut, the moment that would determine how she would be perceived by those around her. And therefore Irvin was obliged to show herself in all her glory, in the best possible way, without allowing the slightest mistake. The hand in a thin glove clenched into a fist, as if trying to hold in all the feelings that were rolling in waves, while demonstrating strength and determination despite the internal anxiety. Without showing her worries and concerns, the girl quietly asked if the moment had come when they were allowed to go out to the event, trying to remain calm despite the excitement that was still taking hold of her. However, Teely suddenly announced that the girl should wait a little, since the gentleman was not yet ready to receive his wife, and her words sounded with a note of solemnity, as if a harbinger of some kind of delay. When the maid tried to console her, the lady turned away and said coldly that she was perfectly aware that her dear husband hated her, and her gaze became heavy, full of sorrow and despair, which was obvious to everyone present. Taking a step back, she suddenly declared that, from that day on, she would try to change her husband's mind, but as if by magic, the beautiful words were interrupted by a sudden silence, as if all confidence had evaporated in the blink of an eye. Suddenly, Fervin appeared before her, and the noblewoman's face twisted in horror, her lovely expression turning alarmed, as if she had seen something that had caused deep inner torment, leaving her speechless. Her cheeks were flushed, and her blue eyes were wide, reflecting a mixture of excitement and confusion that was difficult to hide despite her efforts to maintain an outward calm. The aristocrat, as always, looked impeccable. His appearance was ideal, without the slightest sign of emotion, as if he was above ordinary experiences, leaving behind an atmosphere of severity and imperturbability. Fervin loudly declared that if she really thought he hated her, she had behaved extremely rashly, and his words, sounding with a touch of reproach, left no room for doubt in his determination. A knowing smile appeared on the maid's face, as if she understood perfectly well what was happening between them, and her gaze became soft, full of some awareness of the situation that was soon to be revealed. The servant bowed before the master, expressing her respect, and with restraint said that she was going to leave, leaving room for further orders that it seemed could change the course of events at this moment. Irvin raised her hand, as if trying to stop the servants, her gesture full of determination, as she did not want to be left alone in such an uncomfortable situation next to someone who caused her such conflicting feelings. Smiling awkwardly, the lady asked if they were now planning to go to the cultural event, after all trying to contain her feelings, but still not hiding the slight concern in her voice, hoping that her words would not go unnoticed. However, Fervin, unexpectedly surprising his wife, went to the door and locked it, as if cutting off any possibility of further action on her part, which only added to the mystery of what was happening. After which, the nobleman, in complete contrast to his previous actions, walked decisively towards his wife, as if he was going to present her with something important, intending to conduct the conversation on a more serious level. The nobleman, with his tall and slender figure, seemed to tower over his beloved. His presence was imposing, and he looked like a majestic figure dominating the surrounding space. Irvin began to convince her husband that it was time to go on a holiday. Her words sounded decisive, but at the same time, they hid a slight anxiety that was reflected in the woman's voice, trying to return them to normal life. In the reflection of his blue eyes, the guy seemed to be reaching out his hand towards her, and at that moment, a certain connection arose between them, as if they could understand each other without words, despite all the external obstacles. However, the lady suddenly waved her hand, pushing the guy away, and thus establishing an invisible boundary between them, as if indicating her determination and desire to avoid further rapprochement, at least for that moment. Fervin was struck by such a bold gesture, and the fact that his wife seemed to intend to remove him from her life. His gaze became wary, and his heart was full of bewilderment, trying to understand the actions and motives of his beloved. As his wife Irvin stated that she could not accept such strange and cruel behavior from the nobleman. Her words sounded like bewilderment. Hiding pain and disappointment, she could not understand what could have caused such actions. However, here the aristocrat surprised her by suddenly brushing the hair away from her face, as if caringly, and there was so much tenderness in this gesture that it seemed to completely change the atmosphere, giving everything that was happening a completely different tone. The girl turned away, all flushed. Her face was covered with a blush. She was clearly embarrassed by such attention. But her heart was still touched by this manifestation of care, which was unexpected and did not fit into her previous perception of her husband. The man, watching the reaction, laughed, as if he had completely lost interest in what was happening, and then with a light step walked away, leaving behind only a slight trace of uncertainty that did not leave Irvin. Looking at her husband's back, the lady quietly asked herself whether he had become so accustomed to her new appearance that he did not notice the changes, or whether he had simply learned to hide his true feelings, leaving her in complete uncertainty. The guy sheepishly made the excuse that he was simply worried that if the girl showed herself badly at the event, rumors might start, and his words sounded like an attempt to justify himself, although behind them there was real concern about his reputation. The noblewoman hurried down the long staircase after her husband. Her steps were quick but still graceful, and she tried to keep up despite all the inner excitement that was taking hold of her at that moment. But suddenly, her foot in a white shoe stepped onto the hem of her long dress, catching on the fabric, and this unexpected moment became a turning point when she felt how the fragile balance was disturbed and she lost her stability. Irvin, unable to keep her balance, stumbled and began to fall, her hair flying, as if it was caught in the wind, adding drama to the scene, and she, as if frozen, felt the world around her suddenly slow down. The Duke cried out his beloved's name in alarm, his voice full of anxiety, as if he were trying to bring her back to life with just one word that seemed to be able to dispel all this terrible silence. Their hands were stretched out towards each other, and in that moment of desperate longing, their palms almost touched, but there remained an invisible barrier between them, a symbol of how fragile this moment was. The aristocrat hurried towards the fallen lady, his steps quick and determined, like someone who couldn't afford to slow down his gaze, focused only on her, and he sought to lift her up without thinking about the possible consequences. The noblewoman had lost consciousness and was now lying on the bottom steps, her body lifeless and her face distorted with an expression of pain, as if every breath she took was heavy, and the world around her had darkened, leaving only a helpless shadow. The large mansion, decorated with colorful flowers, had an atmosphere of grandeur and comfort, with the scent of fresh plants filling the air, creating a sense of celebration and sophistication. In the hall, the aristocrats animatedly discussed the latest events. Their conversations sounded with a slight touch of irony and interest, creating an atmosphere in which even the smallest details acquired significance. The nobles spoke loudly of the fact that the estate had not changed one bit since the last event, and there was a slight understatement in their words, as if they were not only assessing the place, but also covertly comparing it to past times. Another aristocrat, dressed in a formal black tuxedo, said that there had been rumors that the Duchess would not be at this social event, and his words attracted attention as if it were a revelation that made those present slightly wary. The guy noticed that the maids had been helping Duchess Carlene from the side all this time, and their quiet, almost imperceptible actions attracted his attention, because it is in such little things that something more is often hidden than it seems at first glance. There, off to the side, stood a handsome young man with white hair and golden eyes. His appearance was unusually attractive, almost supernatural, as if he was part of this refined world itself. But his gaze was filled with invisible anxiety. The aristocrats were completely absorbed in gossip, discussing news and events, their conversations drowning out other sounds in the room, and they seemed absorbed in their own speculations, as if oblivious to everything else that was happening around them. They all wanted to see the changed Duchess, who lay unconscious on the steps after her fall. Her emaciated body seemed to symbolize all the pain and helplessness she had experienced, and now everyone was expecting only one thing: her return. The husband, filled with anxiety, asked the healer if his wife was all right, his voice trembling with tension, and in his eyes there was not only anxiety, but also fear, which he could not hide until he heard a confident answer. The girl herself, her mouth open in confusion, heard how she couldn't perform on stage because of a sprained ankle, and the words sounded with complete involuntary bitterness, as if her plans had collapsed in an instant and her body did not give in to her will. Fervin was just as confused and upset by the news, his face contorted with chagrin, and he couldn't hide his inner discontent, feeling how every moment she couldn't perform was taking them further from their goal. The man blamed himself for everything. His heart was beating alarm, because he had not managed to grab his lady's hand in time, had not managed to prevent her fall, and now this mistake seemed terrible to him, because he felt responsible for her condition. Stubbornly, Irvin stood up from her seat, unwilling to give in to fears and doubts, and firmly declared that she could cope and perform even with an injured ankle. Her determination was unwavering, and she was not going to give in to circumstances. The beauty insisted that they couldn't keep the guests waiting, because many important people had come to the event, and her words sounded with confidence, as if she could overcome any obstacle, just so as not to disturb the order, and not disappoint those present. The maiden's leg was red, and the pain with every step became unbearable, as if sharp needles were piercing her body, making every movement difficult, and her face itself reflected excruciating tension. The noblewoman winced at the unpleasant sensation. Her eyes closed for a moment, and her lips trembled slightly as pain ran through her sore leg again, as if warning her that it would be impossible to continue any further. Suddenly, Fervin, unable to bear this sight, grabbed his wife by the waist, helping her to stay on her feet. His strong hands seemed to give her hope, and she felt the support that gave her the strength to forget about the pain, at least for a little while. The man insisted that the lady should listen to the doctor, as her condition required immediate attention, and the concert could be rescheduled. His voice was full of concern and determination, and his gaze reflected the deepest concern for her well-being. The woman's hand stubbornly squeezed her husband's shoulder, as if trying to convey to him all her determination and confidence. Her fingers felt like a strong support, supporting not only her own body, but also tender feelings. With a determined look and a confident smile, the beauty declared that she had prepared this song especially for her husband. The words sounded with a special accent, as if they contained a whole story that she was ready to tell through music. Looking into the wide, stunned eyes of the guy, she loudly declared that she wanted to sing for him. Her voice sounded with such sincerity and warmth that even the air around her seemed filled with this determination and tenderness. The young couple's hands clasped and their fingers intertwined, as if they had intuitively found each other, creating an invisible bond that could not be broken. It was a moment when their hearts were closer than ever. Fervin squeezed his wife's hand, his fingers wrapped tightly around her palm, and with a slight tension in his voice, he said that then they would go together confidently and decisively, as if there was no other alternative and nothing else mattered. The Duke's ears and cheeks were scarlet, his face flushed with embarrassment and excitement when he could not hide his inner tension, and this color seemed to reflect all his sensitivity and nervousness at that moment. Frowning menacingly, the man ordered his surprised companion not to show her true nature to anyone again, but to continue to maintain an illusion for everyone. And there was such a firm determination in his voice that it seemed he could not tolerate objections. Duke Sibel, already very drunk, with his face red from alcohol, began to interrogate the maid about where the master of the house was. His words sounded with heavy ambiguity, and he could no longer control his emotions, full of irritation and anxiety. The emperor and his wife approached the drunkard from behind, and with cold seriousness, said that compensation for such behavior of the white-haired guy would definitely follow, and his actions would not remain without consequences, despite his drunken state. Smiling, Sibyl said he was simply enjoying the evening, nothing more. His words sounded with a slight ironic note, as if he was trying to hide more behind his smile than he could afford to show. Taking another sip of champagne, the man said with a grin that the Duke's wife was terrible, and such words were full of condemnation, which could not help but cause indignation in the emperor, who was shocked by such rudeness in his speech. He also heard and understood the rumors about how vile the Duchess was, but he did not dare to say them out loud. His internal conflict was obvious, because he realized that even in the highest circles, such conversations could lead to undesirable consequences. Turning away from the handsome man, Caesar turned to him, and with a serious look, asked him to calm down and behave with dignity. His voice was firm and full of authority, like someone who was used to order and respect being maintained around him. Finally, Fervin and the Duke began to descend the long staircase, and all eyes in the hall were riveted on this couple, as if time stood still, and their every movement attracted attention, leaving behind a trail of admiration. They were a truly ideal couple with such harmony in their behavior and views that it would be impossible to believe that in their relationship there was no room for any doubts or omissions, but only sincere feelings. The Empress, unable to contain her excitement, quietly whispered to her husband that the Duke did not take his eyes off his wife, and in that look there was something special, tenderness, and deep affection in which love was evident. Fervin, who seemed truly in love, had rosy cheeks. His gaze was gentle and full of love, and his smile, soft and sincere, shone like a ray of sunshine, giving everything that was happening a special warmth. The couple stood before the imperial family and paid their respects, restrained and dignified, drawing attention to the respect they had for this great house, symbolizing their devotion and loyalty. Caesar, noticing the concern in the eyes of those around him, could not help but express his concern about the condition of Irvin, who had recently lost consciousness, which naturally became the source of many rumors and speculation. Fervin, indignant and happy at the same time, smiled broadly when he heard that the ruler apparently was ready to see his wife more often, considering this a manifestation of special attention and understanding of their position at this reception. Suddenly, Sable appeared in the hall, holding a glass in his hand, and despite his reluctance, also expressed his unpleasant greeting to the Duke and his wife, clearly not sharing their mood and creating a tense atmosphere at that moment. He licked his lips at the sight of the beautiful lady, involuntarily wanting her to be his, and there was something insatiable in his gaze that could not be hidden, since the desires in him were intertwined with an indomitable desire for possession. Irvin felt extremely uncomfortable when Caesar, noticing the rude behavior of one of those present, began to scold him for disrespect and inability to control his tongue, which created tension and anxiety in her soul. Suddenly closing her eyes, Irvin quietly asked for forgiveness from everyone present, realizing that she had behaved inappropriately for the past 4 years, which was incompatible with her duties to her husband and her role in society. In front of the entire crowd of nobles, as silence fell over the hall, she was ready to begin her impromptu concert, deciding to express her feelings and emotions through singing, regardless of the possible consequences. The aristocrats, watching what was happening, froze in anticipation, holding their breath, realizing that this scene full of surprises and emotions would become an important moment in the life of not only Irvin, but also everyone who witnessed it. Irvin's fingers slid smoothly over the piano keys, as if inscribing gentle melodies into the space around her, which magically filled the hall, causing everyone present to freeze in admiration. Irvin began to sing, and her voice, like an angel's, filled the room, wrapping it in soft and touching notes, as if the soul itself sounded in this melody, causing a feeling of delight and surprise in all listeners. The nobles began to whisper among themselves, discussing the incredible talent of the Duchess, admiring her voice and confidence, which without a doubt personified the sophistication and grandeur of her position in society. The lady smugly opened one eye, smiling slightly proud that she was able to make an indelible impression on the audience, feeling how her music was mesmerizing and leaving everyone in the shadow of her impeccable skill. The swollen leg did not stop reminding of itself, giving off a painful sensation that became stronger with each passing minute, making Irvin feel how the pain was taking over her and making her lose strength. The girl could not stand due to the sharp pain, and as if having lost her support, sat down on the floor, trying to cope with the illness, in the hope that at least having rested a little, she would be able to regain her strength and get back on her feet. The Duke, noticing his wife's suffering, shuddered, unable to hide the anxiety that gripped his heart. His man's face was distorted with pain, but love and concern for her did not allow him to remain calm in this situation. However, when he tried to run to her to help her up and support her, she raised her hand, stopping him with a gesture, as if to say that she could handle it herself, not wanting her husband to worry about her. The lady did not want to accept help, so she continued to sing, sitting on the floor, with her hand extended forward, as if by an invisible force, holding on to her fortitude and determination not to allow herself to become weak. The emperor, quietly addressing his friend, could not help but notice how charming his wife was singing wonderfully. The female voice sounded so that it seemed that the music itself penetrated the souls of all those present. The Duke, unable to tear his eyes away from his beloved, seemed enchanted by her voice and beauty. Every sound of her beautiful singing touched his cold heart, and delight and admiration could be read in his eyes. Irvin sang like a bird, loud and free. The female voice filled the entire hall, and every note seemed to be filled with life and energy, creating an atmosphere where nothing could overshadow the talent. The aristocrats were animatedly discussing the talent of the lady, who was widely known not only for her beauty and voice, but also for the cruelty that had manifested itself in the past when she did not hesitate to go to extreme measures to achieve her goals. Sibel, holding a rose in his hand, watched what was happening attentively, and without hiding his surprise, he could not help but notice how much Irvin had changed. Her former rigidity had disappeared, giving way to something soft and mysterious. Irvin looked with disgust and hostility at his competitor, who was clearly also trying to win the heart of his wife. And in his eyes, one could read the determination not to let anyone take away what was only his. Without thinking, he pushed the handsome man away with one decisive movement, harshly directing him as far away from his wife as possible, showing everyone that her heart and attention belonged only to him. The lady, frozen in surprise, did not expect such actions from her lover. Her eyes filled with questions and slight bewilderment, when he without any hesitation intervened at a moment that seemed so harmonious. The man's hand, gently and confidently, grabbed the delicate hand as if asserting his power. But in this gesture, one could feel not only strength, but also softness, which made it clear that she was under his protection and in his care. Fervin, with love and gratitude, kissed his girlfriend's hand, noting her incredible talent and beauty. The guy sincerely thanked her for the amazing song that touched the hearts of everyone present. The boy squeezed the rose in his hand in anger. His face darkened, and a shadow of hatred appeared in his eyes, which seemed to be trying to hide his feelings about what was happening, and this hostility was clearly visible in his gestures. Himself noticing the tension added that from now on, this girl will perform such songs only for him, without other spectators, asserting his right to the talents and the heart of an incredible beauty. The girl, shocked by her husband's words, froze in place when he said that he wanted Irvin to remain only his and no longer be associated with anyone else, which came as a real shock to her. In the popular novel, the villain Irvin appears as a mysterious figure with bright red eyes and blood on her face, so that her appearance plays a key role in bringing the main characters together, adding tension and drama to the plot. As a result of all her evil deeds, she was punished, and a woman's life was cruelly taken away, becoming a tragic end to her role in history, which left a deep mark on the development of events. For the lady who did not expect such a thing, it was a real shock to hear words of love and jealousy from her now husband, which made her take a new look at their relationship, surprising him with real sincerity and tenderness. One day, the girl suddenly heard other ladies discussing how much the Duke was in love with his wife, and this unexpected confession confused her, causing her heart to squeeze anxiously with excitement and uncertainty. Tearing her hand from the nobleman's tight grip, she quickly promised to walk this path with him as many times as he wanted, ready to fulfill his every wish without thinking about the consequences. The nobleman, without saying a word, stood silently in place, looking at his hand as if trying to understand what he had just done and how his actions could affect her decision and their future relationship. Suddenly, the ladies called the Duchess, attracting her attention and causing her to be distracted from her thoughts, because at that moment, all eyes were fixed on her, and she could not ignore such an important request. The red-haired beauty, without wasting any time, addressed the lady with a compliment, admiringly speaking about how beautifully she sang, while her words sounded with sincere admiration and emphasized the true beauty of her voice. The noblewoman hurried to the lady, whose name was Celestia, with joy and a sincere smile, her heart filled with warmth from the anticipation of meeting the lady who had become her true friend. But suddenly, the soft hand was stopped when a man's hand wrapped around her fingers, and the girl froze, not understanding what was happening. Feeling how her freedom was unexpectedly limited, Irvin was stopped by her own husband, who seemed to have no intention of letting his wife go, not intending to leave her alone, despite all the circumstances that could separate them. The man, answering quietly and shyly, filled the space with his gaze, confirming that the lady had promised to fulfill her marital duties, and therefore she had to remain close to her husband without leaving him. The girl, with a soft smile, agreed with the argument offered to her and decided to stay next to her husband, feeling that, at that moment, her place was right here, supporting him in difficult times. After which, she thanked the lady with bright red hair with sincere gratitude, apologizing for not being able to join their company, as circumstances required her immediate departure. Irvin couldn't help but let out a cheerful laugh at being called kind. The word sounded so unexpected and real that she felt a little proud of her reputation. The girl's black hair was gathered into a neat bun, exquisitely decorated with bright flowers and elegant jewelry, which gave her charming appearance a special sophistication and tenderness. As Fervin gently touched his wife's tin hairdo, adjusting her hair, he gently silenced her, making it clear that his attention was focused only on her at that moment. The nobleman, looking at the lady with restraint, asked the beauty to behave calmly, assuring that he would take care of everything and not to worry. His actions would be full of care and understanding so that she could feel protected. The night was unusually beautiful. The stars shone especially brightly, and the moon, like a mirror, reflected the light and created an atmosphere of mysterious peace around, filling the world with something almost magical and exciting. Irvin, saying goodbye to the imperial family, stood on the steps of the mansion with a smile on his face, as if trying to show that despite all the farewells and difficulties, gratitude and peace reigned in his heart. Caesar and his wife stood nearby, enjoying the moment and sharing Irvin's joy, as they were happy to spend this time together, feeling a special connection and warmth surrounded by loved ones. The lady, with a slight smile on her face, began to think about how she would be able to continue performing in front of the public, confident in her talent and determination to do it more than once despite all the difficulties. The faithful husband intervened in the conversation, gently explaining that if his wife did not want to go on stage, he would under no circumstances force her, understanding that true happiness lies in freedom of choice. Suddenly, as if sensing the tension, Sibel intervened in the conversation, offering his services, saying that he was ready to court the lovely Duchess, adding a note of playfulness to the atmosphere of the discussion. Caesar loudly complained that the intervention of the guy with white hair and an impudent character was completely inappropriate, but despite his displeasure, he decided not to pay much attention to it. Instead of continuing the argument, Sibel turned to the girl, tenderly calling her flower, generously showering her with various compliments, as if trying to win the girl over with his charm and attention. A strong hand covered with a white glove smoothly reached for the woman's hair, but at that moment she froze in place. In fear, her heart skipped one quick beat, as if ready to break in panic. The Duke's eyes suddenly lit up with hatred, malice, and anger, as if he couldn't contain the storm of emotions that swept over him from rage, and these feelings were so obvious that they could not be ignored. With a blow full of determination and strength, he knocked away the hand of the rude, impudent man, confidently defending his wife, and a fire lit up in his eyes, ready to fight for her safety and dignity. Sibel, upset and hurt bitterly, noted that the Duke was not just a bad man, but wild and unbridled, and his words reflected the depth of his disappointment in this cruel world. Embracing his beloved, Fervin announced in a loud and confident voice that he was only brushing away a mosquito, and that there was no need to attach any importance to it. His actions were not aimed at anything more. Caesar, with a wide smile on his face, said that he would look forward to the next meeting with the Duke and his wife, as if hinting that this meeting promised to be no less interesting and exciting. The door slammed loudly, making a sharp sound, as if trying to emphasize the sudden end of everything that was happening, creating an atmosphere of tension and farewell. In the darkness of the estate, in the privacy of their home, the young couple remained holding hands tightly, as if this simple rigidity were their only union in a world full of uncertainty and worries. Stepping back, Fervin loudly declared that it was time for him to leave. His words were decisive, but there was a hint of regret in them, as if he did not want to leave this moment, but was forced to take a step aside. But the lady's hands grabbed him tightly, not allowing him to leave so easily. She was not going to let him go without words, and her gaze was full of persistence that even at this moment the heart demanded answers. Persistently, with a slight emotion in her voice, she asked if the nobleman liked the song, as if hoping that the woman's efforts had not passed him by, and that her tender soul had found a response in his heart. In the eyes of the handsome aristocrat, the lady looked beautiful, and his heart beat faster, as if in her presence the whole big world became brighter, and everything else lost its meaning. But instead of telling the truth, Fervin lied, claiming that the lady's voice was so terrible that even the piano could not cover the sound, hoping to somehow soften her embarrassment. The girl lowered her head, confused, and with an empty look, realizing that her behavior had previously left much to be desired, and the weight of realizing her own mistake was almost unbearable. However, in an attempt to justify herself, she began to explain that she had moved to another country, and being in a new place, she experienced fear and loneliness, which could affect her behavior and perception of others. Clutching his head, Fervin repeated to himself over and over again that people cannot change in one day, no matter how hard they try, and this inevitably led him to disappointment and doubt in the world around him. The frowning guy, with an expression of displeasure on his face, loudly declared that he always thought that this time, too, the noblewoman was only pretending, incapable of real emotions, playing a role, as always in this theater of life. The lady's face took on a sad and thoughtful look. Her large eyes, full of melancholy, seemed even deeper, and expressed a whole range of emotions, as if reflecting the entire weight of her inner world, drowning in sadness. She walked past her husband, a barely noticeable forced smile appearing on her face, as if trying to hide all her feelings, although inside her heart was full of experiences hidden behind a mask of calm. Before leaving, the maiden thanked her husband for a wonderful evening, into which they both put so much emotion and effort, realizing that such moments are worth much more than any words of gratitude. Fervin reached out his hand, trying to stop his wife, but his lips remained silent, not uttering a single word, although in his eyes there was a silent request hidden under a layer of unspoken emotions. Instead of speaking, he walked quietly towards her, hugging her from behind his arms, wrapped around her body, as if trying to strengthen the bond that had always existed between them and never let go. His face into her dark hair, inhaling its scent, feeling how this smell filled his entire soul, reminding him of the invisible power of her presence, and mentally prayed to the girl not to leave him, not to disappear from his life. However, the girl quietly asked the handsome man to let her go. The voice itself sounded soft, but there was an urgent request hidden in it, as if the beauty felt the need to leave despite all the tenderness of the moment. Turning to face her husband, she confidently declared that she had no intention of running away from him, and her words sounded firm and sincere, reflecting her inner determination and affection, which she did not intend to hide. The Duke, his feelings acknowledged, realized that he truly enjoyed his lady's singing, and her presence nearby, appreciating as never before these moments when her gentle voice and originality were the whole world to him. The lady was angered by how the guy could not directly say what he really felt, but instead lied first, trying to hide his true emotions, which only increased her irritation and discontent. Loudly, with clear determination in her voice, she declared, folding her arms across her chest, that it would be nice if her husband's words were reflected in his actions as accurately, because words without actions lost all meaning in her eyes. Turning away in irritation, Irvin muttered that her husband was kind to everyone but her, as if her feelings and her needs were less important to him than caring for others. But at that moment, when she was absorbed in her thoughts, suddenly there was silence. The faithful husband leaned towards her, and without saying a word, tenderly kissed her, causing her heart to skip a few beats from unexpected but so pleasant feelings. The Virgin took off her crown, which had always been a heavy symbol of responsibility and burden for her, and placed it nearby on the bed to rest a little, enjoying the long-awaited peace and comfort of silence. Her memory flashed back to the moments when she had felt embarrassed, awkward and shy after her first kiss with the Duke, and her heart still fluttered at the memory of that exciting moment. Shyly, with slight embarrassment, the young man stated that his wife, despite all her modesty, insisted on showing him her feelings and intentions without hiding what was really important to her. The lady covered her face with her hands, as if trying to hide her inner uncertainty and embarrassment, and unable to hold back her shame. She lowered her gaze, feeling her blue eyes getting lost in deep thought. She covered her face with a pillow, trying to hide from the world and take refuge in silence to forget at least for a moment about everything that tormented her, and to avoid unnecessary glances, which only deepened her inner discomfort. Moreover, Irvin could not forget the tragic end of the original villain, her death which remained in her memory, causing painful memories and anxiety for her own fate. Crying, hiding her face under the pillow, the maid suddenly heard the cry of the servant, who reported that the new dress was ready, and now she could finally change, forgetting at least for a while about her worries. It was Teely, a faithful servant, who was ready to help her mistress by providing her with everything she needed to help her change her clothes and return to her normal appearance, at least for a short time, forgetting about heavy thoughts. The new dress was incredibly beautiful. It was decorated with pearl shades, exquisite patterns, and detailed elements, which gave it an exceptional, almost magical look, emphasizing the refined beauty of its owner. The maid brushed off the praise modestly, stating that it was her work since she had put her heart and soul into creating this outfit, and she was proud of how it turned out, hiding her satisfaction behind outward modesty. Smiling slyly, she wondered what the gentleman had said about her singing, still hoping that his words were full of praise and recognition of her talent, because all her efforts had not been in vain. The lady blushed in response, remembering her husband's kiss, which was full of love and tenderness, and this memory warmed her fragile soul, filling the space of her heart with warmth and happiness. Turning away and pressing her hand to her head, Irvin said that the Duke had called her singing nonsense, which had outraged all the servants, because such words had deeply hurt her, making her feel unappreciated and undervalued. In an effort to reassure her mistress, the woman tried to justify the gentleman, assuring him that he had not meant anything offensive, and that his words were merely an expression of fatigue or momentary dissatisfaction, and not a true attitude. Suddenly, the maid suggested that her mistress take an evening walk, hoping that it would help distract her from worries and unnecessary experiences. The maiden standing at the mirror thoughtfully agreed, anticipating that the fresh air would help her cope with her inner tension. The man sat down wearily in the chair, feeling how heavily fatigue was pressing on him, and his body, exhausted by a long day, demanded rest, and his thoughts were still wandering, finding no peace. The Duke lowered his head down, clutching it, with his hand feeling his strength draining away after the kiss with his wife, which left him with a strange yet exciting feeling as if he had lost his energy. Their lips barely touched, but that brief moment was filled with such tenderness and hidden meaning that it left an indelible mark on their hearts, requiring no further words or movements. The guy, experiencing a slight wave of excitement and heat from the memories of his beloved, began to unconsciously pull his collar to the side, trying to cool down from the overwhelming emotions and vivid images that remained in his memory. Deciding to get some fresh air, he opened the window, enjoying the moment, and feeling the light breeze touch his lovely face, bringing with it the pleasant scents of the night and taking away all the worries of the day. The window offered a beautiful view of the night landscape drowning in darkness, and in the center stood a cozy gazebo, which seemed to beckon him with its peace and warmth, promising silence and solitude. Suddenly looking down, he noticed how, against the dark horizon in the distance, his wife was turning her head strangely, as if noticing or feeling something, and her face expressed slight wariness. Suddenly, the shoes she was taking off were tossed aside with a light, almost casual movement, as if she was losing interest in something or trying to get rid of something unnecessary along the way. The noblewoman did not behave like a real lady. She lifted her legs with ease, placing them on the table, and sighed joyfully, as if not noticing that her behavior contradicted all the canons of noble manners. The Duke, embarrassed by such an indecent sight, looked away, feeling a wave of awkwardness wash over his face, because such behavior did not correspond to either her status or the decency to which he adhered. The girl, not paying attention to his embarrassment, continued to gently massage her tired legs, enjoying the moment of rest after a long day, when every gesture brought her some relief. The man couldn't help himself from this sight. His gaze became more and more intense, and beads of sweat began to slowly drip down his face, as if he was overcome by a strange mixture of passion and bewilderment. Turning away, he tried to convince himself that his behavior was unworthy. He should not spy on his wife, but her behavior attracted his gaze, and he could not take his eyes off her despite his internal contradictions. The lady had cute, graceful ears that gave her face a special charm, and her hair, dark as night, fell beautifully on her shoulders, giving her image a mysterious appeal and softness. The guy's hand hovered in midair as he stood by the window, trying to find a moment to gently tuck a strand of the lady's hair, but his gesture was so reserved that it seemed almost unconscious, like something more than just caring. Irvin was like a goddess descended from the heavens. Her presence felt like something supernatural, like a beautiful and mysterious entity that merged with the surrounding world, leaving a light aura of magic around her. Fervin, blushing in embarrassment, buried his face in his hand, trying to hide his awkwardness, because his feelings were conflicting, and he did not know how to cope with what was happening around him. Suddenly, large eyes full of deep thoughtfulness rose up to where the window was, as if she felt something that came from that very place, and her gaze became sharper, more penetrating. The lady froze, peering intently into the closed windows of the estate, as if she felt or heard something that made her heart stop, and her thoughts began to slip away in the direction of an indefinite premonition. The girl continued to look into the distance, absorbed in her thoughts, when suddenly the voice of the maid was heard, who brought delicious food for her lady and chocolate, filling the atmosphere with coziness and tranquility at that moment. Joyfully, the beautiful lady turned around, and with gratitude in her voice, thanked Tilai for her care. Her eyes shining, reflecting her appreciation for the attention and affection she was receiving at that moment. The Duke himself, feeling himself overcome with emotion, sank helplessly to the floor, breathing heavily, realizing that he had almost fallen into a trap, having done something unworthy, and his face was covered with a layer of anxiety. He clenched his hand into a fist, as if trying to strengthen his resolve, and also clenched his teeth tightly, feeling how the internal tension was growing, filling his chest with a heavy load of inexpressible emotions. The morning dawn filled the estate with rich light, which slowly penetrated into every corner, illuminating the luxurious rooms, creating an atmosphere of calm and tranquility in this magnificent house. The girl slowly woke up, feeling the first rays of morning light softly touch her face, and with each moment, her consciousness returned from sleep, absorbing the surrounding world and the new day. A worried Teely stood frozen, standing above her mistress, as if waiting for some sign or command, not knowing what to do at this moment, when the silence was almost deafening. The sleepy noblewoman woke up. Her eyes opened with difficulty, and looking around in confusion, she asked the maid what had happened, trying to understand why she was in this state, not remembering what had happened during the night. Suddenly, the girl remembered that from that day on, she had to meet her husband every time he arrived at the palace, and her heart sank, realizing the responsibility that fell on her fragile shoulders. The maid had a cup of tea in her hands, barely hovering. Her careful movement gave the scene an exquisite touch, creating an atmosphere of morning peace and comfort in this moment. Having had a good time, they had tea in the gazebo, enjoying the silence, and every word spoken seemed significant, while the tea with the aroma of herbs gave their conversation additional warmth and harmony. Upset, the lady recalled the tragic end of the original novel, where she herself became the source of misfortune for the Duke, realizing that her fate repeated events that could not help but affect her feelings. Concerned, the girl asked Tilly how she could get closer to her husband, hoping to get advice that would help her navigate the complicated relationship and find a way to his heart. A smirk appeared on the maid's face, as if she knew the answer to that question, but perhaps chose to keep her thoughts to herself, watching her mistress struggle with her inner feelings. The maid continued to help her mistress put on her dress slowly, and at the same time talked to her about the cufflinks, keeping her busy with conversations to distract her from the worries that were haunting her mind at that moment. It was meant to be a gift for her husband, a carefully thought-out gesture that expressed her feelings and care, hoping that he would appreciate the effort and attention to detail she had put into the gift. Teely explained to the owner that only a wife could choose cufflinks for her husband, as if it were a special ritual symbolizing her place in his life and their mutual obligations to each other. The servants carefully braided a bow with decoration in the mistress's hair, creating an elegant and sophisticated image that emphasized her status and attracted attention, adding the finishing touch to her appearance. The noblewoman froze in surprise when she heard that she and her husband would soon have to start trying to conceive a child, as it was part of the family tradition, and she had to realize that she could not escape this expectation. Clutching her head, the lady sighed wearily, feeling her thoughts crashing down on her and the tension inside her growing. This was a new challenge she had to come to terms with, and it frightened her. The estate was luxuriously furnished. Majestic chandeliers sparkled on the ceiling, and doors made of expensive wood created an atmosphere of wealth and sophistication, as if every element of the interior had been thought out to the smallest detail. The butler was waiting at the entrance, standing in a long corridor, whose walls were decorated with many paintings reflecting art and history, creating a majestic and solemn feeling that reigned in this place. When he saw the lady, his face changed, and he was very surprised, since he did not expect her to appear in such a state, which only emphasized the unusualness and importance of this visit. The noblewoman loudly declared that she had come to help her husband choose new clothes. Her words were full of confidence, and she intended to show concern, demonstrating her taste and attention to his needs. Since the lady had never been to this place before, her husband, somewhat haltingly, said that he should have warned the emperor first of her visit, since it was an important event that required special attention. But then Teely intervened in a commanding tone that could not be denied, declaring that Alfred should open the door immediately, her stern gaze leaving no room for doubt, and she was full of determination. The maid, wishing her mistress good luck with a soft smile, stepped aside, watching her determined steps, while the mistress, not paying attention to what was happening around, confidently entered inside. The doors slammed shut behind her, leaving the servants outside, and the silence that followed seemed to emphasize the importance of the moment, closing the entire world beyond the threshold of this mansion. At this moment, a sly and slightly mean grin appeared on the faces of the servants, as if they knew something that was hidden from others, and their looks were filled with some mysterious and sinister confidence. Irvin called her husband's name loudly, the woman's voice echoing through the empty corridors until she could find him desperately and impatiently searching, as if she sensed that something important was about to happen. There was no one inside the room. It was empty, and its rich furnishings only emphasized the feeling of solitude and peace. The expensive furniture seemed to have been created not for use, but only to impress. The interior was truly luxurious. The room exuded aristocratic sophistication, and the bedroom looked like something out of a fairy tale with exquisite decor and soft fabrics that created an atmosphere of coziness, but at the same time seemed to hide something more. Frowning as she looked around the room, the beauty couldn't understand why the original Irvin was so cruel to her husband. Her thoughts were confused, trying to figure out this contradiction and understand her actions. Suddenly, the paper lying on the table began to fly in different directions, and the girl gasped in surprise, not expecting such a turn of events. Her eyes widened, trying to understand what exactly happened. She quickly began to gather the documents, throwing them on the floor, trying to maintain order. But her actions became clumsy when suddenly Fervin entered the room, completely naked, leaving her completely confused. The man's bare feet froze next to the beauty, and the silence that fell in the room was broken only by his steps. The girl could not believe her eyes. Her heart skipped a few beats before she realized what was happening. The noblewoman turned around in shock when she heard the noise behind her. Her eyes met the unusual situation, and she couldn't contain her surprise, not knowing how to react to what was happening in front of her. Brushing his wet hair back with his hand, the man noticed that his wife had come into his room for the first time, and this unexpected visit left him slightly perplexed, making him wonder about her intentions. The beauty's cheeks turned red from embarrassment, and her gaze involuntarily lingered on her husband's magnificent body. Her breathing itself became intermittent, and she could barely restrain herself from allowing saliva to flow because of his unimaginable attractiveness. The nobleman slowly approached his guest, his confident movements adding tension to the atmosphere, and each of his steps seemed inevitable, as if he knew how to affect her feelings. The virgin, noticing his approach, began to retreat. Feeling growing uneasy because he wrapped only in a towel on his hips, was walking straight towards her, making her heart beat faster from excitement and bewilderment. She shyly covered her face with her hands, trying to hide her emotions, and feeling awkward, she became more and more immersed in her own world, trying to avoid his gaze and focus on why she came. As her husband leaned down, Irvin suddenly screamed, startled by his closeness. Her voice piercing the silence, breaking the tense moment, and she felt her nerves give way under the pressure of what was happening. Fervin himself was displeased as his wife had violated his personal space. His face became serious, and his gaze became hard, as if he expected a different behavior from her in this situation. With a smile, the nobleman said that they were now very close, his words sounding with a slight hint that what had happened could not help but leave a mark on their relationship, even if it was something not entirely expected. But Irvin turned away, closing her eyes, and objected that she had only come here to choose cufflinks for her husband, and nothing more. Her words sounded firm, and she tried to return the situation to the framework of her original intentions. Fervin explained that the cufflinks were just a pretext for something else, more adult things between husband and wife, which greatly surprised the lady because she did not expect that their meeting could take such a turn. He whispered in his wife's ear that guys usually had more energy in the morning, which was why she came here to help him. His words sounded intimate, and they contained a game that Irvin was not ready to join. The handsome man had a wide grin on his face, satisfied and confident, as if he knew something she didn't, and his expression was full of smugness, as if he was enjoying her confusion. Irvin herself felt bad and angry, because she did not like the ridicule from her interlocutor. Her face turned red with indignation, and inside a feeling of resentment flared up, which she could not immediately hide. Deciding to take revenge, her scarlet lips stretched into a mean smile, as if she was already weaving her insidious plan, ready to test its strength and respond to his ridicule in kind. She slyly approached the nobleman, pressing herself against his chest, and gently asked if they would now follow the family tradition of procreation, and the words were full of ambiguity, which made his heart beat faster. Now it was the guy's turn to blush. His face flushed, and he opened his mouth in confusion, not knowing what to answer, because the beauty had put him in a position from which it was difficult to get out without losing face. The lady stopped immediately, realizing that she was doing strange things, and touching her husband too intimately, her mind suddenly cleared up, and she felt as if she had violated boundaries that she was not yet ready to cross. Suddenly, their hands intertwined, and this unexpected gesture was something new for both of them, breaking the usual distance and increasing the tension between them, as if both felt a hidden closeness that had previously been inexpressible. Fervin loudly ordered the maiden that if she was being frivolous, she should immediately let go of their hands, his voice stern and demanding, as if he was trying to bring the situation back under control. The lady began to tease the aristocrat, saying that he should not be embarrassed, because they were married. Her words were full of lightness and playfulness, as if she was trying to ease the tension by adding a little humor to the moment. As Irvin suddenly began to fall to the floor, her black hair spread out across the surface, creating a wave effect that unexpectedly engulfed her body, and the moment turned out to be much more chaotic than she expected. The lady winced and blinked. Trying to recover from the fall, her breathing was ragged and her thoughts were confused as she tried to understand what had happened, because everything was happening too fast. She realized with surprise that Fervin was lying on top of her, his strong form looming over her, like a heavy reminder, his gaze focused on her eyes, making her heart beat faster. The noblewoman was very embarrassed when she realized what an intimate situation they found themselves in together. The woman's face turned red with shame, and the noblewoman felt how her position was becoming more and more awkward and uncomfortable. Looking into the eyes of his beloved, the Duke said that he agreed to fall for his wife's provocation and make her a happy woman. His words sounded confident, but there was a sneaky grin on his lips that betrayed his intentions. There was a mean grin on the man's lips, as if he was pleased with the situation, and her reaction was just an additional entertainment for him, which he decided to play on with the deliberate provocation of all feelings. Covering her face with her hands, Irvin screamed for her husband to first go and wipe the moisture off his body and preferably get dressed. Her voice was full of irritation, and in her eyes a mixture of embarrassment and indignation at what was happening was visible. The couple sat awkwardly on the bed, distanced from each other in silence, as if neither knew how to continue this moment, which was unexpectedly awkward and full of hidden tension. It was noticeable that the Duke was also embarrassed. His cheeks were flushed from under the towel, and this feeling of awkwardness was visible on his face as he tried to hide his confusion, not knowing how to behave in this situation. At this time, the servants stood outside their gaze tense, and while the butler was worried and shifting from foot to foot, the cunning maid grinned, meanly enjoying what was happening and believing that her plan had worked. Alfred was tired of waiting and wanted to check how things were with the young masters, but the maid herself had a different opinion, deciding that her intervention would be more appropriate and important at this moment. The woman grabbed the butler by the collar and firmly refused to let him in. The gesture was firm and unconditional, as if she were deciding that this moment should be reserved only for those who truly had the right to participate. She began to scold the stupid servant, confidently, asserting that it was absolutely indecent to spy on the love of young people. Her voice was stern and full of condemnation, as if she was putting him in his place for unacceptable behavior. When the man finally realized what was happening behind closed doors, his face turned red as a lobster. He felt extremely awkward, realizing his mistake and the shame that now lay on his shoulders. Teely winced in disappointment as she realized that the butler had misunderstood her gaze becoming tense, and her sense of unease growing as the situation was far from what it had seemed at first. The Duke dried his fair hair with a towel, his movements slow and almost mechanical, and his expression, despite everything that was happening, remained focused, as if he was trying to regain control of the situation. Irvin tried not to peek, and not to look at the handsome man's naked torso. Her gaze was tense, and her thoughts were confused, because the presence of her husband in such a form caused her a feeling of awkwardness and shame. The man grabbed her hand, not letting her go. His grip was firm and confident, as if he was determined to keep her close despite his desire to avoid further contact. The nobleman asked his wife to help him choose clothes, since she had already come. It would be logical, but his request was not as simple a request as she expected, but rather a continuation of their interaction. The lady began to resist saying that if he meant procreation, then she was not his assistant. In this, her words were full of reproach and clearly expressed her position on what was happening. After Fervin promised that he would not harass his wife, his voice was calm, but a slight mischievous spark could be seen in his eyes, as if he understood that his words could not completely hide his true intentions. The girl, embarrassed, agreed and hurried away to find good clothes for her husband. And return her steps were quick, and her heart was beating anxiously because the situation continued to be tense and uncomfortable. Opening the door, the beauty stopped, seeing in front of her a whole collection of beautiful suits of aristocratic style. Her eyes sparkled with surprise because it was so unexpected and beautiful, as if a whole gallery of fashion had opened up before her. She began to select the right shirt, carefully examining the fabrics and colors, her fingers sliding over the materials until she found what she thought was perfect for her husband. Suddenly, when the girl turned around, she saw her husband throwing the towel off his hips. His actions were quick and confident, and she couldn't help but notice how his body looked at such a close distance, which made her even more embarrassed. When Irvin realized that the guy was wearing pants, she breathed a sigh of relief, although her face was still red with embarrassment, and she couldn't shake off the feeling of awkwardness, even though the situation was starting to clear up. The nobleman's face formed a knowing smile as he realized that his wife had thought of him in a completely different way than expected, and his gaze filled with a slight humor. Apparently, her innocence was not so absolute. Frustrated and covered in shame, the lady finally began to choose suitable cufflinks for her husband. Her movements were careful and slow as she tried to focus on the important task to distract herself from the awkwardness. The woman's fingers grabbed the beautiful red heart-shaped decoration, and she felt her fragile heart beat faster as the decoration appeared in her hands, like a symbol of the feelings that went into this choice. Holding the jewel in her hands, she turned to the guy, worried whether he would accept her choice, because this gesture was a symbol of all attempts to get closer to him, and she could not predict how he would react. Grabbing the handsome man by the shirt, she drew his attention to herself and a little nervously said that she had finally made her choice. Her sweet voice sounded decisive, but a spark of doubt still played in her eyes. Red hearts were pinned to the sleeves of the nobleman's white shirt, and when she saw them on his clothes, her heart filled with pride in her choice, little symbols of love that she had chosen so carefully. With a wide smile, the beauty declared that from that moment on, she wanted to become closer to her husband, and her words were full of determination. And in their sound, there was a sincere hope that their relationship could become warmer and deeper. With a blush on his cheeks and an indelible joy in his eyes, Fervin agreed with a slight sigh that he too longed for intimacy with this amazing lady, whose beauty did not leave him indifferent. Shyly lowering her gaze, the noblewoman remained surprisingly pleased at this moment, as if hiding a smile which, despite its modesty, was a vivid confirmation of inner harmony and happiness. Later, with a hearty laugh, she laughed happily, discovering that her husband had become much softer and kinder with her, which certainly brought a new warm atmosphere of mutual respect and tenderness into their relationship. Rumors circulated in the secluded corners of the kingdom that ever since the Duke and his wife had become more closely associated, their lives had changed for the better, and everyone around them began to notice how their mutual understanding had changed. Teely and Alfred had a loud argument about the veracity of these rumors, fiercely debating whether these speculations were true or simply a figment of someone's imagination with no basis in reality. The unexpected and heated argument was interrupted by the Duke himself, who, coughing into his fist, politely attracted the attention of everyone present, thereby forcing everyone to remain silent and concentrate on his words. At this, the servant, bowing her head with deep respect, spoke quietly and restrainedly, informing them that the meal was ready and that all those present could go to the dining room where they were already awaited. The many servants who stood in the corridor stood in line, and with an expression of respectful esteem, greeted the young master, bowing to him, as befits such occasions, not forgetting to show their gratitude for his attention. However, Fervin did not respond immediately, only asking his wife to have dinner with him, expressing a desire for her to prepare for them a delicious gourmet meal that would bring them pleasure. The maids standing nearby began to quietly discuss how much the Duke's attitude towards his wife had changed, how warm and caring he had become towards her, and how clearly they had become close to each other. Irvin, upon hearing her husband's request, immediately beamed with joy, promising that she would prepare for them the most delicious dish she could, with a full sense of love and attention to his desire. But as soon as she said those words, her face suddenly darkened, and she became a little uncertain when she asked if Fervin really wanted to have dinner with her that night, in such an intimate close circle. The man's hand, reaching forward with a smooth and confident gesture, tried to calm her down, as if conveying all his care and tenderness through this gesture. The fingers lightly touched the skin as if he wanted to relieve all the worries. Grabbing the shy lady by the chin, Fervin gently lifted her face, and looking into her eyes, said that this night would be special, and that there would be a union between them. After these words, he turned around, and without saying another word left, leaving his surprised wife and happy Teely in complete silence, where each of them experienced the moment in their own way. The nobleman, not paying attention to their reactions, jumped on his white horse, and swinging the reins, rode away with a decisive movement, disappearing into the distance of the night, leaving behind only traces on the ground. The maiden, full of anxiety and bewilderment, shouted after her fleeing husband, with eyes full of grief and bewilderment, trying to understand what he meant by mentioning some strange solitude between the two of them. To which her husband, smiling with a bold and smug expression on his face, replied that she would only find out and understand everything late at night, hinting that the true meaning of his words would only be revealed with the onset of darkness. A contented smile played on his face, filled with undisguised pleasure, and a blush played on his cheeks, emphasizing his inner satisfaction with the current situation and the mysterious intrigue. In the original version of the novel, after their first wedding night, filled with excitement and anticipation, the young couple, the Duke and Duchess, never again shared the same marriage bed, which became an unsolved mystery of their relationship. That's why Irvin was overcome with a wave of horror and shock when she learned that on this very day she would have to spend the night with her husband, which became a real test for her and an unexpected turn in their relationship. The maids, standing to the side and quietly whispering with soft smiles, discussed how the young couple had finally made peace, having overcome all previous misunderstandings, and how they had now advanced in their union, resolving not only emotions, but also physical intimacy. Teely, standing next to her mistress, could not hold back her tears of happiness, because she knew that now the Duke and Duchess, having overcome all barriers, would finally be able to conceive a child who would become the long-awaited heir of their family, embodying their hopes for the future. Irvin herself could barely hold back her tears, overcome with fear of what might happen tonight. Thoughts about the future tormented her, and despite her desire to be strong, anxiety did not leave her heart. The bright and merciless rays of the sun softly penetrated the windows of the estate, filling the atmosphere with warmth and tenderness, as if instilling hope in the soul that the night would bring not only fear, but also changes. The maid, with a slight smile on her lips, said that everything should have happened so long ago from the very beginning, because finally the moment had come when everything fell into place and took its course. The maiden, with joy and relief in her voice, said that now the elders would not condemn the lady, since she would give the Duke a long-awaited heir, which would free her from all her previous worries and reproaches. Realizing that she had said something unnecessary, Teely quickly covered her mouth with her hands, apologizing to the lady, who sadly lowered her head, as if not knowing how to properly respond to her words. The noblewoman, herself upset, was lost in thoughts about how stupid and intrusive the servant could be, that despite her good intentions, she managed to plunge her into such confusion. Remembering her husband, the lady began to shake her head from side to side in embarrassment, trying to get rid of unnecessary memories and forget about him, at least for a while, so as not to give in to emotions. With a forced smile, the lady, trying to regain her composure, told Teely that her husband had probably said all this only out of politeness, without any special intention, and that his words should not be taken too seriously. The maid quietly whispered in the girl's ear that her husband would not dare to touch her without her permission, trying to calm her down because she understood how worried the mistress was at that moment. The noblewoman, looking at the maid in bewilderment, asked her why Fervin had suddenly started talking about sharing a bed together, since it seemed strange and inappropriate given everything that was happening. Smiling slyly, Teely explained that recently the lady had become kinder, prettier, and all the changes could not go unnoticed, so perhaps the gentleman could not resist such a charming transformation. At that time, the imperial palace inspired grandeur. Its walls concealed stories of centuries of tradition and power, and inside there reigned a strict discipline, which, despite its external inaccessibility, was full of secrets. The clever Duke sat over the documents, reading and signing papers, with concentration absorbed in important state affairs, his face remaining calm despite the importance of the moment and the responsibility he bore. He clutched the cufflinks that his wife had chosen, especially for him, with his hand, as if he could feel her presence in these small details that were imbued with care and attention to every moment of their lives. Then Irvin, with a slight smile, offered him to revive their marriage, looking confident and beautiful, as if at that moment she was ready to return to them those feelings that they once lost, and return harmony to their relationship. However, it was clear that the girl would be under pressure from society, because everyone around her, with curiosity and sometimes condemnation, pointed their fingers at her, pushing her to take a step that could lead to risk. Sitting at his desk in his office, TOT thoughtfully reflected on the future in which an heir would be conceived, and on his wife, pondering how all these events could change his life and relationship with her, filling his mind with important thoughts. The nobleman didn't even notice how another man quietly joined him behind him, his steps barely audible, and his presence felt only by the change in the tension in the air around him. It was Renz Celestine, a count of illustrious lineage, with a grin on his lips and hair as black as night. The boy came up and asked curiously what had happened to his friend, that he was so sad, losing his usual confidence. Taking the letter from his colleague, the Duke moved away, feeling his personal space being violated. The man who had intruded into his thoughts without invitation was now standing next to him, causing him to resent his unusual spontaneity. Without waiting for an invitation, Renz confidently sat down on the chair next to him, looking closely at his friend. He noticed that the Duke had new cufflinks, and it was probably these that were the cause of his recent inner unrest. Fervin first chose heart-shaped embellishments, which were carefully embroidered onto his shirt, deciding that this detail would add romance and expressiveness to his look for an important meeting. The Count was shocked, his blue eyes wide, when he learned that it was his wife who had chosen these cufflinks for the Duke, as he would never have thought that she would attach such importance to this detail. Fervin, noticing the displeasure on her face, felt disappointed inside, but looking at the others, he realized that his wife's actions were quite logical, because she always tried to help her husband in choosing accessories, which was not unexpected. Returning to reading the letter, the nobleman suddenly froze from what he had read, unable to immediately comprehend what he had just learned. These words struck him to the depths of his soul, causing his heart to freeze and his thoughts to stop. On paper was a message from the emperor, the decision of which was required immediately because its implementation had to be completed that same day, which added tension to the situation and gave it urgency. Renz wished good luck to his friend, who, overwhelmed with stress, clutched his head, not knowing how to cope with the situation and what to do in response to such an unexpected challenge. The Count, waving his arms around loudly, declared that the Duke would not return home soon with such a task, but he himself was already getting ready to leave, since his business could not tolerate delays. The upset, handsome man looked away, remembering that in the evening he had a meeting with his beloved, for which he would certainly be late, and this only added to his worries at this anxious moment. Surprised, Renz froze when he heard the question about why he fell in love with his wife, as this unexpected question made him think about the reasons for his feelings, which seemed to have always been obvious. After which, he began to tell how beautiful his wife was, with long, silky hair and eyes like stars, because her beauty captivated him at first sight and remained in his heart forever. Coughing into his fist, Renz added that his wife's kindness had also won his heart, which, however, did not particularly impress the Duke, who was skeptical of such words. The guy, all red with embarrassment, pointed his finger at the Duke and asked a question in return, asking why he fell in love with Irvin, since his curiosity now knew no bounds. Having come to his senses, the man began to explain that this lady had become his first and last love, because her image had forever left a mark on his heart that had not been erased over the years. She was like a wild red rose the moment they first met, with scarlet lips, black hair, and blue eyes that, like magnets, attracted his gaze and also captivated his fragile soul. Renz winced and then exclaimed in surprise that he had not thought that his friend would fall so head over heels in love with a woman so deeply and sincerely that it would become his real revelation. Continuing to work on the documents, Fervain agreed that he would attend the event the following week, would arrive there with his wife as required by the decree of the emperor himself, and everything should be prepared properly. His pen hand trembled, and he paused for a moment, aware of the importance of what he had just written, as if the words themselves had a special meaning. The man asked his friend again who would be at the upcoming celebration, which was supposed to take place very soon, since he was interested in what kind of people would attend this important event. It turned out that one of the candidates for the Duke's wife would be at the event, namely Stella, a charming and young lady whose presence added a special touch of intrigue to this event. Fervin spent his entire childhood alone in an abandoned mansion, abandoned by his parents, and this isolation left a deep mark on his soul, shaping his outlook on the world and his relationships with people. The young but already cold boy was cared for only by his nanny Teely, who was the only person who could bring him at least a little warmth in a world full of loneliness and alienation. He was also accompanied by Miss Stella, a young girl who was always by his side supporting him and being his only friend, despite all his isolation and seclusion from the outside world. Renz was amazed that the Duke did not react in any way to the fact that his childhood friend would be at the party, as this discovery seemed significant and even a little surprising to him in the context of what was happening. The guy had no objections when Fervin explained that he was already married and was no longer interested in other girls since his heart was no longer free, and all his feelings were given to his wife. Raising his hand and putting it behind his back, Renz apologized for his stupid behavior, realizing that such a strange act might seem inappropriate and out of place in the situation. Fervin rose from his seat and decisively declaring that it was time for him to go and meet the emperor, prepared to leave the room, anticipating an important meeting that required his attention. With a smile, the man added that he wanted to get home as soon as possible to spend time with his wife and do things with her in bed, enjoying the peace and comfort of the family hearth. Ren, surprised, pulled away from his friend, not knowing how to react to such frank words that clearly went beyond the usual conversations between friends, leaving him confused. The boy stared at the closed door, sweat pouring down his face from discomfort, as if every second of silence was an excruciating ordeal that he couldn't explain. With a very sad expression on his face, Renz muttered that apparently Lady Irvin had really changed a lot since her behavior, and words began to surprise him, becoming something new and unusual for his perception. Teely insistently repeated that the lady should have at least once met the gentleman's gaze, which in her opinion would have helped to establish the atmosphere of the meeting, and made her understand the importance of this moment. The maids helped the lady dress as beautifully as possible to seduce the master, confident that this would help to achieve what she wanted, and also so that the lady could conceive a child from him as the female role required. The girl screamed indignantly when she heard such a discussion among the maids, not believing her ears, that such things could be the subject of discussion, and that someone dared to speak about it out loud. Teely reassured the lady by assuring her that she had prepared a special musk for her, which according to her was supposed to help improve her mood and give her confidence in the future. Teely's niece, all embarrassed, carried a bag on a tray, from which a strange smell emanated, causing everyone present to bewilder and slightly worry due to the unusual aroma around. Teely took the bag from her relative, sternly ordering her to stop sniffing the lady's gift, as it was completely inappropriate, and she should no longer show curiosity about this strange substance. With a mean grin, the maid told her mistress that this bag would bring her not only a special smell, but also indescribable sensations that she might not even suspect. Irvin, unable to bear such a statement, turned away sharply, putting her hands in front of her as if trying to fence herself off from everything that was happening, and resolutely refused to accept such a strange and suspicious gift. However, the maid did not listen to her mistress's will with a stubborn expression on her face. She literally shoved the bag under Irvin's long skirt, leaving her no chance to refuse this gesture. Teely, satisfied with the execution of her plan, grinned widely, turned away, and without further ado, walked away. Satisfied that she had done her job, not paying attention to the reaction of her mistress. The woman was about to ask her niece to bring rose water for the lady to freshen the air in the room, but unfortunately, her request was not fulfilled, as the niece had already gone somewhere, leaving her in difficulty and without help. Marian, like a wild March cat, suddenly pressed herself against her mistress's skirt, not hesitating to leave traces of drool on the exquisite fabric, as if this was her only desire. Closeness to her object of desire. Teely, outraged by the indecent behavior of her relative, was forced to discreetly but decisively push Marian away from the young lady trying to stop this unwanted and frankly indecent contact and restore order in the room. The maid, as if anticipating her next step, was ready to return, and again grabbed the hem of the Duchess's dress in order to sniff with greedy curiosity and passion this alluring scent that attracted her without memory and tempted her. Nothing could stop the girl, and despite all the circumstances, she resolutely headed back to Irvin, step by step approaching her, as if she was reaching for the light that beckoned her, leaving no doubt in her determination. Irvin was by far the most beautiful lady whose radiance could outshine even the brightest stars in the sky, and her beauty was almost unearthly, and it seemed that the very atmosphere around her was filled with light, reflecting her magnificence and grace. The head maid's niece, with curiosity in her eyes, noticed that the mistress so rarely attended meetings with other aristocrats, and this intrigued her more and more, because in her eyes, Irvin always remained a mystery, hiding more than she showed. Teely, lost in thoughts about the upcoming important event, quietly muttered under her breath, thinking about how much trouble the preparation would require. She needed to order a new dress, think through everything down to the smallest detail, so that everything would be perfect and worthy of her position. Suddenly, the butler entered the mistress's chambers and announced that the gentleman had conveyed to her an important message that required immediate attention, leaving no doubt that it was something important. The maiden, slightly surprised by the butler's visit, accepted the letter, and without wasting any time, began to read the words written by her husband, in which he explained that due to urgent matters, he would be delayed at work and would probably not return home until late at night. The maids standing in the corner of the room were clearly confused by the news, especially one of them, who was much more worried than the mistress herself, who was sitting on a chair and carefully studying the contents of the letter with an imperturbable expression on her face. The lady breathed a sigh of relief when she realized that she would not have to spend the night in the same bed with her husband, and her soul suddenly felt lighter, as if a burden had been lifted from her shoulders, because the coming night now promised to be much calmer. The beauty's face twisted in disgust when she noticed how confused the maids were, as if this scene caused a feeling of incomprehension in her, because she was not used to seeing such weakness in her subordinates. The servant, having accepted the words of praise from the mistress, modestly folded her hands in front of herself, feeling how pleasant it was to hear recognition for the work done, because it gave her confidence in her abilities and strengthened her faith in her usefulness. Rising from her seat, Irvin, flashing a new golden dress, loudly announced that she was going to take a walk in the garden, and her words sounded like orders, with her characteristic confidence attracting the attention of everyone present. Teely, wanting to keep her company, immediately offered to go together, but Irvin, barely looking at her coldly, replied that it would be enough for her to walk alone, leaving Teely perplexed and making her feel useless. The servants who were watching what was happening were unhappy with this arrangement, because in their opinion, the master was paying too much attention to the emperor, forgetting about his wife, which could not help but cause hidden discontent in them. The empress had already given birth to 2 girls, but despite this, Duke Sibel was appointed heir to the state, which caused many questions and disputes among the courtiers, as many were expecting the appearance of a son to continue the dynasty. The maid's niece, worried about this situation, cautiously expressed her opinion, stating that if the ruler did give birth to a son, he would probably become the future emperor, replacing the duke on the throne in the future. Teely, unable to bear such conversations sharply, and loudly shouted at her relative, condemning her for spreading dirty rumors that could affect the reputation of the entire imperial family and bring confusion into court life. After this, the woman, not wanting to continue this unpleasant conversation, abruptly opened the door and, gathering her strength, headed for the exit, full of determination to end this conversation because she still had household chores awaiting her that required attention and care. Suddenly, Alfred appeared at the door again, awkwardly holding a note intended for the head maid. His face reflected some confusion, and he blushed as he handed over the letter, feeling the tension growing in the air. Awkwardly looking away, the boy said with obvious embarrassment that this letter was from the gentleman, adding that he had brought another important message, which had been expected for a long time, since it concerned the fate of the Duke himself. The Emperor, finding himself in a rather awkward situation, froze in the moment, holding the dessert in his fingers, as if not knowing how to properly respond to the sudden intervention and the request that had just become known. The Duke, realizing the gravity of the moment, repeated his request, asking the Emperor to release him from service so that he could devote himself to the continuation of the family line and ensure the future of the family, passing this duty into the hands of his heir. He persistently asked the ruler to let him go earlier so that he could complete all his affairs, and Caesar, showing generosity, graciously agreed, allowing his old friend to fulfill his wish, albeit with a little regret. The Duke was beside himself with anger when he learned that Caesar had invited him here only to laze around and engage in meaningless conversation at the table without any serious purpose other than to have a snack. When he saw that his friend was about to leave, the Emperor, slightly embarrassed, asked him to stay for at least a couple of minutes to try at least one dessert to taste, because it was a pity to say goodbye so quickly after such a fleeting conversation. Caesar, handing him the sweet with a kind smile, suggested that if the Duke did not like this dessert, he could take it with him and take it to his wife, not forgetting about taste preferences, making a gesture to ease the situation and not leave her without attention. The plates, with only empty spaces and small crumbs left on them, became a testimony to the end of the meal, as if a reminder of how quickly this dinner had passed, leaving only a feeling of lightness and satiety. The family of the rulers of the empire was quite satisfied after a delicious meal from which only empty dishes remained, and no one bothered to leave the slightest piece of food. Everyone was full and immersed in their cozy world, forgetting about the rest. With a smile, Caesar noticed how his friend had indeed changed a lot, and there was a slight irony in his voice, as if he was surprised at how events and time could change people so much, leading them to completely new states. Evening came, and in the darkness, the maids, as ordered, searched throughout the entire territory of the house, not finding even a hint of a place where the mistress could be. Searching the yard and the street, they anxiously watched every step since the mistress had disappeared during the day. Suddenly, Fervin appeared unexpectedly leading his horse, and with obvious bewilderment asked Teely what was going on, because judging by his tone, the situation was clearly beyond the ordinary. Teely, embarrassed by the question, awkwardly began to explain that they had lost the owner of the house, and now they could not find her anywhere, neither in the house itself nor on the street, and her face expressed confusion, because without knowing the reasons for her disappearance, it was difficult to find any ways to find her. The aristocrat, completely overcome with horror and anxiety, froze in place. His heart sank with anxiety when he learned that his wife had disappeared, and no thought could calm him down at that moment, because the disappearance of a loved one is always scary and unpredictable. It had all happened only a few hours ago, when it was still light, and daylight was in the yard, filling everything around with a warm light. Then it seemed there was not the slightest sign of trouble, and everything was going on as usual. But now it seemed distant and impossible. The beauty, walking so easily and freely through the garden, enjoyed nature and silence, absorbing all the harmony around her, breathing in the fresh air, when in her soul, despite her external carelessness, there was not the slightest suspicion that her life would soon change. However, in her thoughts, there was only one person, her wonderful husband, like a prince, who was always her support, her inspiration, and who seemed to her ideal in every sense, her love, which seemed to be immutable. Trying to get rid of the obsessive thoughts, Irvin, not realizing how much anxiety was taking over her, shook her head sharply, as if wanting to throw off the heavy thoughts. She tried to concentrate, trying to find the strength in herself not to lose control of the situation. Clenching her hand into a fist at her chest, she reminded herself of her main goal: to become a good wife, to fulfill all her duties, and no matter how bitter it was, to peacefully separate from her husband, forgetting about everything that once connected them. Suddenly, Irvin's gaze was drawn to a small house that was hidden in the shadow of the garden, as if hidden from prying eyes, as if the garden itself wanted to hide it from unwanted views. It was a small wooden room, almost invisible among the tall bushes and greenery, which by its location seemed to invite Irvin to come closer and solve its mystery. The girl, driven by strong curiosity, could not resist the temptation to enter the house, quietly opened the door, and once inside, immediately noticed the simple furniture, which despite its modesty, still attracted attention with its neatness. Looking around and seeing no signs of life, she asked loudly, addressing the emptiness of the room, if anyone was there. But her voice received no answer. Only echoes of silence returned to her. There was not a single person inside, but in the corner of the room there was a small bed, and next to it a wooden table, which with its simple but solid appearance seemed to complement the atmosphere of comfort and peace, despite the loneliness of this place. Deciding that it would be better to return to the garden, the girl decided to postpone the conversation about the strange house until better times, deciding that later there would be a more convenient moment to share her impressions of that place with Tili. However, her thoughts were suddenly interrupted by a glance that fell on a small black kitten sitting motionless near the chair. Its fluffy fur and quiet presence caught the girl's attention. Approaching the animal, the lady leaned towards it with a soft expression on her face, showing genuine sympathy and carefully asking if the poor thing had lost its mother, feeling the helplessness of the little creature. The kitten looked amazingly cute. His big green eyes looked a little wary, and despite his sad expression, he remained incredibly charming. Smiling widely, Irvin made the decision to stay with the animal and calmly said that she would wait here next to him until his mother returned, confident that she had made the right choice. Soon evening came, and the sky gradually turned a warm orange, giving everything around a magical, peaceful light, as if the world itself was waiting in anticipation of something special. Tili, searching hard for her mistress in the garden, shouted loudly that she had brought a new letter from the master, her voice echoing throughout the quiet space, attracting the attention of everyone around. Suddenly, her gaze fell on the barn from which two black cats ran out. One was larger, the other smaller, and both looked at her warily, as if realizing that they could become part of some important event. The woman, noticing the cats, began to swear loudly, shouting at them, accusing them of having again entered the house, without any reason, not understanding how they had found a way to get in there again. The maid, hearing the noise, opened the door with a frowning expression on her face, deciding to check if these animals had caused any disorder inside, and her steps were cautious and her gaze wary. However, to her surprise inside, she found the sleeping mistress who had fallen asleep carefree right on the floor, her whole body relaxed and her expression peaceful, as if she had simply rested, not noticing that she was on the cold floor. Tili, noticing her mistress, instantly rushed towards her, loudly exclaiming in panic, worried about her condition. The female voice was full of anxiety and concern, as if she felt that something was wrong. The woman's hand froze in the air. Her fingers did not have time to touch the object, as she, feeling that the moment had come, thought, and something insidious flashed in her eyes, forcing her to stop for a moment. The woman herself, after thinking for a second, suddenly came to the conclusion, with a sly smile, that her plan to bring the young gentleman closer was indeed a good one. She knew that this step could not only dispel the tension, but also create opportunities for the future. The Duke, watching his nanny's sinister smile, felt a chill of fear run down his spine. His eyes anxiously followed her every movement, not understanding what exactly she was planning. As if nothing had happened, the maid calmly told the Duke that the lady probably wanted to spend the night with him in a more intimate setting, not wanting the servants to witness this. Her voice sounded confident, as if it was completely natural. The man, stunned and amazed, froze in place, unable to understand what exactly was happening, and what an amazing feeling had taken hold of him, causing him to stand in a complete stupor. Fervin wasted no time in hurrying into the barn, quickly opening the door, and his gaze immediately turned inside, where he saw something that made his heart clench in surprise. There, in a dark corner, Irvin was sleeping on the cold floor, and despite the late night, her peaceful sleep was not disturbed by anything, and her very condition caused him anxiety and tenderness at the same time. Concerned not understanding the reasons why his beloved had fallen asleep, not on the bed, but right on the floor. The man sat down next to her, his gaze full of care and anxiety, because he could not understand what led to such a strange state in which she found herself. The lady lying in her restless sleep looked truly charming. Her small mouth was slightly open, and her long eyelashes, like invisible swings, gently touched her skin, which gave her face an expression of serenity and innocence. While no one could see him, the man could not contain his desire, and unable to contain his emotions, he loudly said his wife's name, feeling how this simple word, spoken out loud, made his heart beat faster, as if bringing him back to reality. His hand shook as he thought Irvin was starting to wake up. Her movements, though barely noticeable, made his heart beat faster, and he froze, trying not to disturb this quiet moment. The lady, lightly rubbing her eyes slowly, woke up from her sleep, and soon opened her eyes, realizing that she had woken up in a completely unfamiliar place. Her thoughts were vague, and her body was still drawn to rest. The beauty, coming to her senses and assessing her strange position, was surprised that she had fallen asleep in such a place on the floor, exposing herself to the cold air, unable to understand how it had happened. When she finally noticed her husband opposite her, the girl shuddered in surprise, and not immediately realizing what was happening, recoiled in surprise, her face turning red with embarrassment. Coughing in embarrassment, Fervin, feeling the awkwardness of the moment, reminded his wife that this cottage belonged to him, and the girl could do whatever she wanted here, because he did not intend to limit her freedom of choice. Fervin, without wasting any time, extended his hand to his wife, gently saying that they should go home. His gaze was full of tenderness and care, as if he wanted to hurry back to the familiar environment, where it would be calm and cozy. Fervin himself was dressed in the suit he had put on that morning, which gave grounds to conclude that he had just returned home, as if his day was just beginning and not coming to an end despite the late hour. Suddenly, the noblewoman turned away, and with unexpected determination refused to follow her husband, which surprised him to the depths of his soul, because he could not have foreseen that she would act so unexpectedly at the moment when he was ready to return. Finding herself in this situation, the aristocrat flatly refused to share a bed with him, which at first confused Fervin, making him wonder what could be hidden behind such a decisive refusal, which put him in a somewhat awkward position. The guy said, puzzled, with a slight bewilderment in his voice, that a young couple like them should sleep together, because in his opinion it was natural and logical for people who were married, even if their relationship was far from ideal. However, the girl, not wanting to remain on the sidelines, firmly demanded from her husband a promise that they would sleep in separate beds. Her voice was decisive, and in its tone there was an unshakable confidence that such an agreement must certainly be observed. Irvin added, with a slight hint of irony, that they would only appear as a couple in the presence of other people. But there was in fact no intimacy between the two of them, as their relationship had nothing to do with real family harmony. The guy froze in shock at his wife's words, in which she admitted that she thought he didn't want children from her, and this discovery stunned him, making him wonder how exactly she came to such thoughts that it would seem had no relation to the reality of their relationship. Turning away, the guy quietly, with increasing tension, said that he never said that he didn't want intimacy with her. His words sounded restrained, but there was hidden pain and bewilderment in them, because he didn't understand how such a misunderstanding arose. Standing on her feet, Irvin firmly ordered him to speak louder, because nothing could be heard. Her voice was determined and a little insistent, as if she could not allow herself to remain in the dark, needing clarity and certainty in her husband's words. From her dress, slightly fluttering in the air, came a strange but pleasant smell that seemed both familiar and new, filling the space around her with some barely perceptible mystery, as if there was a riddle hidden in this smell. Hearing his words, Fervin could not restrain himself, and falling to the floor, tried to inhale even more deeply that strange but alluring smell that did not give him peace, as if he was absorbing something special and important that he could not explain. The boy was covered in sweat, feeling his body fill with a strange wave of heat, and the blush on his cheeks betrayed his embarrassment and confusion when all his feelings suddenly overflowed and became difficult to control, as if every breath was a struggle. Suddenly, unable to contain his emotions any longer, the man hugged his wife tightly, pressing her to him with such force that it seemed as if he wanted to merge with her into one whole, unable to tear himself away from her presence, absorbed only in her image. His hands were clutching the woman's black strands of hair with such force that it seemed as if he couldn't let go, and his teeth were clenched tightly as if he was trying to hold on to the last remnants of control, unaware of how the feelings were taking over him, almost paralyzing his mind. The body odor, so unfamiliar and at the same time alluring, drove the aristocrat crazy, and his thoughts became more and more confused, as if he was losing the ability to think clearly, and his passion for the beauty became unbearably strong, causing an irresistible desire for intimacy. Irvin, suddenly alarmed by this behavior, pushed the nobleman away from her, not understanding what he was allowing himself to do. Her eyes filled with rage and bewilderment, because she could not understand how he could so easily violate the boundaries of their relationship. The nobleman was breathing heavily, sweaty, and with a flush on his cheeks, his body was overcome with excitement, and his mind, struck by desire, could not find peace, as if he was a prisoner of his own emotions that burst out despite his attempts to restrain himself. Without thinking twice, he leaned down and buried his face in the soft fabric of his wife's skirt, enjoying her scent, curiously inhaling the subtle notes of her perfume that filled the air. Soon his gaze fell upon a small bag from which came a surprisingly pleasant smell. This aroma turned out to be white deer musk, known for its properties of arousal and attraction. It turned out that this entire intricate plan was part of a clever game by Li, a clever maid who was thus trying to play on the feelings of the Duke and Duchess, striving to bring them closer. The guy with a mocking smile abruptly threw the bag behind his back, declaring that it was just a pathetic excuse on the part of his wife trying to justify her actions with the help of ridiculous tricks. The lady's entire appearance, her posture and manners, indicated that she was completely ready to spend her wedding night with him, as if she had been prepared in advance for this important and exciting moment. The aristocrat, approaching the lady with dignity and firmness, ordered her to listen now to his sincere, heartfelt desires, which he intended to express, and which were supposed to change their relationship. Irvin felt her vision darken and her insides tighten with fear. She trembled, unable to suppress the wave of horror that swept over her at the thought of what her husband might do to her at this moment. Suddenly, with determination and strength, the Duke lifted the noblewoman into his strong arms, lifting her with ease, as if she were a feather, preparing to carry her to a new place and begin something important for their future. Capriciously, with a stubborn expression on her face, the lady began to resist, demanding that her husband immediately put her down on the floor, swinging her legs without any embarrassment, trying to free herself from his hands. However, when she least expected it, the guy, ignoring her resistance, lay down next to her, carefully placing her on the bed, and then climbed on top of her, taking on a decisive, commanding look. He did not react to his beloved's words in any way, but only quietly approached the soft skin, continuing to move forward, while the girl herself, all red with embarrassment, could not contain her excitement, feeling the closeness of his body. Fervin, hearing the lady's words that others would soon be looking for her, moved away, breaking away from her a little as if afraid of the consequences of this warning. However, it turned out that Irvin was extremely unhappy with the place where the Duke decided to take her and make love, because she expected that their intimate moments would take place in more suitable conditions. The nobleman, hearing such an accusation, was extremely indignant. He cried out furiously, insulted at being called an animal, and his eyes filled with anger and resentment. An argument ensued between the couple, with each trying to defend their point of view, and no one seeming to give in, adding to the tension that reigned between them. Suddenly, the white shirt was easily and almost effortlessly removed from his shoulders, casually thrown to the floor as if it no longer mattered, because all attention was focused on what was happening at that moment. Irvin's skin flushed with excitement, as her gaze couldn't tear itself away from the handsome and seductive sight that was unfolding before her, as if her husband was becoming even more attractive in this tense moment. Approaching her lips, the husband not hiding his emotions with a slight mockery, but at the same time, with complete seriousness, declared that she was the first to provoke him to such actions, forcing his behavior to go beyond the limits of normal restraint. After which, having calmed down a little, he added that every day he fought with himself, restraining his desires that raged so strongly inside. And now that all this had accumulated, he could no longer resist what was happening between them. In the original, there were no such feelings, such deep experiences and worries, when the Duke, having decided to take a new wife easily and without unnecessary hesitation, got rid of the old one, as if she no longer had any significance in his life. Irvin, looking her husband straight in the eyes, sincerely admitted that her only desire was to simply live with him peacefully, without all these complex intrigues and conflicts, not demanding anything more from life, only peace and harmony. The nobleman, hearing these words, seemed to be petrified in shock and incomprehension, because for him it was a real blow to realize that the lady so openly trusted him, believing that he would believe her words and feel her sincerity. Suddenly, it started raining outside the window, pouring and powerful with thunder and thunder that seemed to reflect the tension that reigned in the air between them, as if nature itself had responded to their difficult conversation. The lady's stomach suddenly growled with hunger, and the man, catching this signal, stood up from his seat, deciding to go get a bag of food to satisfy her needs and prolong their communication, which seemed to bring them closer together. Irvin insisted that they continue the conversation despite the interruption of hunger, but a loud and slightly embarrassed sound from her stomach made her shut up, reminding her of how inexorably time was dragging on. And so the moment came when the young couple sat at the table opposite each other, devouring desserts, enjoying each bite as a symbol of their shared, albeit brief, peace and warmth that they found in each other. The guy was pleased that he had managed to find something suitable for her in this strange and seemingly completely unremarkable barn, food that could at least slightly satisfy her hunger and allow them to continue their quiet but important pastime. The red liquid, as if filled with life force, slowly poured into the glass, its bright color sparkling in the dim light, filling the atmosphere with sensual anticipation. Irvin, without resistance, gratefully accepted the glass of wine. Her lips touched the rim, and she took the first sip, enjoying its taste, which warmed her from the inside and made her feel a certain lightness in this moment. With a smile that hid love and tenderness, the handsome man watched his beloved with pleasure. His gaze was full of warm admiration, and he could not take his eyes off her sweet face, which reflected sincere joy. The man's hand, with long and graceful fingers, was extended forward, as if inviting her to something new, tender, and perhaps even more intimate, but without violating that thin boundary between them, which was full of respect. The man's laughter, genuine and cheerful, sounded when he noticed where the manners of the ideal wife were, because her mouth was covered in cookie crumbs, as if she could not cope with this simple treat. Embarrassed and slightly confused, the lady turned to justify herself and began to complain, claiming that the cookies were so delicious and fragile that it was impossible to eat them without leaving crumbs. The Duke himself, without changing his expression, and with firm determination in his voice, insisted that they had to sleep in the same bed, because for him it was an obvious and natural step, but his words clearly upset his wife, causing her slight displeasure. The girl tried to regain her former calm, but her husband calmed her down, promising that he would not force her to do anything and would not commit shameful acts, which calmed her down somewhat, but left a slight tension in her soul. Recalling the main character, Irvin said that in reality, people can always find support and comfort in their loved ones, in someone who understands and loves them, and that it should always be like this, with someone who is close to the heart. These words outraged the guy to the depths of his soul, and he jumped up from his seat loudly indignant, not believing that she could think that he had another partner. His face distorted with indignation, and his eyes flashed with rage. Ignoring her flushed cheeks, her husband's gaze remained dark and intense, and his mouth was pressed into a hard line, reflecting all the rage and discontent that he was trying so hard to contain inside. He continued to walk down the street, unable to find peace, while the light outside the window of the house was on a symbol that the tension continued to build, and everything inside him demanded an outlet. In the barn, the stove continued to crackle and consume the wood, radiating a warmth that seemed so contrasting and cozy, while in the house there was an anxious and tense atmosphere. The noblewoman, with a smile on her face, devoured the pages of the book, completely immersed in its plot, not noticing the unrest around her, which grew with each passing moment. There was a thunderstorm raging outside, lightning flashed brightly in the sky, and the weather was terrible, as if nature itself was reflecting the storm of emotions raging in the house, increasing the tension in the air. Fervin, like a good husband, lay calmly in bed, waiting for his wife. His body was relaxed, but there was still a hidden wariness in his eyes, as if he was expecting something important. Approaching the nobleman timidly, Irvin asked him timidly if he was going to sleep on the bed, her voice quiet, full of uncertainty, as if she herself was not sure what was going to happen at that moment. Having received consent, the girl, without wasting time, turned away, and with determination, but with a slight irritation in her voice, loudly declared that then the beauty herself would sleep on the floor, not wanting to be intrusive and demonstrating her independence. Suddenly, her female hand was intercepted by a male one, and without saying a word, he stopped the lady as if warning her against a decision that was perhaps not as harmless as she thought. The handsome man suggested that his wife sleep together that night. His voice was quiet but confident, as if it was not just a proposal, but something natural that was supposed to happen between them. Before the noblewoman could say a word against him, she was suddenly pulled down and found herself in his arms, losing her balance, and was surprised to feel her body begin to fall to the side. In the blink of an eye, Irvin found herself lying right next to her husband, her face so close to his, and his sly smile suggested that it was all intentional, and there was something a little playful and tense about the moment. His hand, tightly clutching part of her dress, pulled her to the side, as if not wanting to let her go, and his whole posture said that he was ready to act, not giving her the opportunity to escape. After this, Fervin covered his lady with a blanket, softly and carefully, and speaking to her with a warm and sincere voice, explained that he was worried that she might get cold and wanted to make sure that she would be safe and comfortable next to him. The girl wanted to insist that she would sleep on the floor, but as soon as she removed the blanket and felt the cold that penetrated her to the bones, she immediately realized how wrong she was, and her body trembled from the cold. She obediently lay down next to her husband, covering herself with a blanket that seemed to wrap her in a warm cocoon, and at that moment she felt how his care warmed her, not only physically, but also morally. Irvin, despite all the softness and comfort around her, felt very tense. Her thoughts could not calm down, and sleep did not come as if she was locked in her own experiences and doubts. However, sleep eventually overtook her, and unable to resist, she closed her eyes, plunging into the dark embrace of Morpheus, leaving everything around her behind. All this time, the Duke lovingly watched his sleeping beauty. His gaze was full of care and tenderness, as if he wanted to remember every detail of this moment, appreciating her peace and trust. He hugged Irvin tenderly, holding her close. His embrace was soft but full of care, as if he wanted to shelter her from all worries and give her a sense of security. He remembered their wedding, that exciting moment, when they became one family, and a fear arose in his heart that now perhaps the lady would reject his feelings, and also his sincere love, and he did not know how to cope with it. The man flinched as the lady suddenly began to move her body, leaning forward, and he felt his heart skip a beat as his thoughts suddenly became confused by her unexpected actions. He opened his mouth shyly, feeling the hot breath that touched his skin, and this touch was so close and intimate that he couldn't help but feel a wave of excitement wash over him. Fervin tried to pull away, but Irvin stubbornly continued to press herself against him, her body seeking warmth and protection, as if not wanting to let him go, despite all her attempts to resist. The Duke had no choice but to embrace his beloved, feeling how her presence brought him peace, and in the end, they simply fell asleep together, covered by the silence of the night and mutual care. The woman's hands tightly squeezed the man's waist, not wanting to let go. Her fingers instinctively reached out to him, feeling in this embrace everything she needed: warmth, safety, and love. As the guy tried to pull away to undress the lady, feeling the sudden change, began to shake from the cold, and her body seemed to shrink, realizing that the warmth had been lost. Irvin's hand tightened on the fabric of his clothes, wanting to find comfort and warmth in this gesture, as if it was in these simple touches that she could find confidence and peace. Irvin looked seductive, despite her vulnerability. Her body was slightly tense, and her face showed a slight pain from the cold that was penetrating her, despite her attempts not to show it. The Duke's hand gently brushed away the strands of hair that were in the way, and falling over his beloved's face, his fingers gliding through her dark locks, with such care that it seemed like a moment when time stood still and the world around her disappeared. The lovers' mouths were incredibly close, their lips almost touching each other, and in this silent but intense moment, it seemed that one more breath, and something more than just intimacy, would flare up between them. However, quickly realizing what was happening, the man, blushing with shame, quickly moved away from the lady, realizing that his actions could be perceived as something inappropriate, and he needed to stop before he crossed the line. The man lay on his side, turning away from his wife, trying to hide his inner embarrassment. He didn't want to be the one to break her trust, not wanting to do anything that could be called dirty or unworthy. Unable to resist, Fervin tenderly hugged his wife, wanting to warm her with his warmth and care, feeling how her body gradually relaxed in his arms, and how anxiety and tension began to go away. Previously, this woman seemed cold and unapproachable, as if hiding all her emotions behind a protective barrier, as if hiding them behind a fan, not allowing anyone to see her true essence. But now she had changed, like a beautiful, confident, yet fragile flower blooming in the morning sun. She had become warm, soft. Her smile was sincere, and the kindness in her eyes was captivating. Lying in bed with his wife, the man quietly confessed his love to her, his words full of tenderness and sincerity, as if he wanted every confession to be imprinted in her heart forever. The beautiful estate, the fountain, the flowers, all these images seemed to be part of their world, which he created for her, a world filled with harmony and love, where there was no place for pain or regret. Irvin woke up in a soft bed, rubbing her eyes from sleep with her hand. Her body was not yet fully awake, but the light warmth emanating from Fervin helped her to finally wake up and feel the comfort of this new loving world. After blinking a few times, Irvin saw Tali standing in front of her, bowing her head in respect and watching her with mild curiosity. The maid greeted the lady quietly. Her voice was soft, but there was genuine concern and respect in it, as if she had been a part of this family for a long time. The noblewoman shook her head in surprise, not understanding how she ended up in the bedroom, because she clearly remembered how she fell asleep in the barn among the cold night air and shadow. It turned out that Fervin had personally carried his wife back into the house, putting her to bed, carefully covering her with a blanket, and despite his worries, he could not leave her in the cold. Teely stood nearby, watching the moment with quiet admiration and attention, seeing how the husband cared for his wife, how he laid her down tenderly, showing how deep his love and devotion ran. The maid literally glowed with happiness. Her eyes sparkled with joy, and she quietly muttered how good it was that the young couple's relationship had changed for the better, that love and care now filled their home. The lady's hands suddenly clenched tightly on the fabric of the blanket, and her body trembled with anger and discontent, recalling the conversation with her husband in which they discussed her behavior in front of the elders. And these memories stirred up her inner unrest. Irvin remembered their conversation when she had promised to behave with dignity in front of her elders. But despite her words, she felt how difficult it was to maintain that image when her feelings began to conflict with her duties. The noblewoman clutched her head in horror, her thoughts suddenly becoming confused, and she realized that Teely probably thought that there had been intimacy between her and the Duke, which only added to her inner chaos and shame. A broad smile appeared on the maid's face. Her eyes sparkled with curiosity and amusement, and everything that was happening seemed to her to be something incredibly interesting and exciting, as if she were witnessing a great secret. With a bright blush on her face, the woman said that the lady should not worry, because now the Duke no longer left her alone at night, and her situation became much calmer, feeling the care of her husband and his presence nearby. The lady almost burst into tears when she heard that, as soon as Fervin had sorted out his political affairs, he would visit her constantly, and these words filled her soul with both happiness and slight anxiety for the future. Irvin wondered if her husband wanted children purely out of duty to fulfill his obligations to the family, or if he had a personal desire to become a father. And this thought haunted her, making her wonder about the depth of their relationship. Suddenly, Teely started talking about how the help had apparently played a role, and the bag with the smell had been useful, adding a strange note to the conversation that Irvin couldn't quite understand. The girl was angry, embarrassed, and wanted to say everything she thought about such help, because this situation clearly threw her off track and made her feel awkward and vulnerable. Fervin, watching what was happening, thought that perhaps Teely was trying to seduce him, because their faces were too close, and the tension in the air began to be felt with every second. Suddenly, Teely's niece burst into the room, calling loudly for her aunt, her voice sounding impatient, as if she brought important news, and her appearance broke the silence, attracting the attention of both ladies. The girl apologized for her rude behavior, but hastened to inform them that she had arrived with an important announcement that could not be delayed, and her serious tone made Irvin and Teely wary, waiting to hear what news she brought. Teely and Irvin froze in surprise when they heard that the lady was finally expecting her wife to come for a fitting after 2 weeks, and this unexpected information immediately attracted attention, causing excitement and questions about what this could mean. The girl answered the maid that she herself had heard for the first time that they would go to the famous Madame's clothing store, and her words emphasized her surprise since this news was absolutely unexpected for her. The maids, hearing where they were going to go, froze in shock, their mouths open in surprise, because the shop of the famous madam was considered a place for very wealthy and influential people, and they could not believe that their mistress was going to visit it. Both of their faces simultaneously broke into smiles, causing Irvin to flinch away, feeling uncomfortable in the situation. Madame Burton was the very clever woman who sewed exclusively for the imperial family, and her skill was unrivaled in the kingdom. Irvin blushed at the thought that her faithful and kind husband had hired such an expensive and world-famous dressmaker for her, and a feeling of awkwardness overcame her. Suddenly, Teely's niece, without hesitation, asked the lady a tactless and impudent question, asking what exactly she had done with her husband on their wedding night, which caused the headmaid to be loudly indignant. In response to the unacceptable question, Teely, shocked by her charge's behavior, hit her on the hand and immediately apologized to Irvin, realizing that her reaction was too harsh and inappropriate. The young maiden explained, embarrassed and cautious, that she was very worried about the traces of blood left on the sheets after their night, and did not know how to act correctly in such a situation. Irvin, taken aback by such frankness and the unexpected turn of the conversation, froze in shock, not expecting such a direct and shameless question, which made her feel uneasy and confused. With a straight face hiding her excitement, Irvin loudly declared that nothing had happened since she had been fast asleep that night, and remembered absolutely nothing about what had happened, trying to hide her confusion. Covering her relative's mouth with her hand, Madame Teely, with deep sympathy and consolation in her voice, assured Irvin that she did not condemn her and was ready to support her in everything, no matter what happened. Irvin, putting her hand to her chest and biting her lip a little, finally calmed down. Her face became a little softer, and she sighed with relief, feeling how anxiety began to leave her. Teely, choosing to remain silent, did not reveal to Irvin that she had previously bandaged the master's arm, where there were deep wounds, preferring to keep it a secret. Smiling slyly, the wise woman understood that she should not interfere in the relationship of the young couple, leaving their intrigue unsolved so as not to destroy the fragile trust between them. The imperial palace, majestically erected in the center of the city, towered in its beauty and power like a symbol of power and wealth that could not fail to attract attention. The golden corridors of the palace, illuminated by magnificent chandeliers, were filled with conversations and rumors in which people whispered about secrets and hidden affairs hidden behind the high walls of this majestic building. The man walked in front alone, and the other one in uniform walked behind, as if they were separated by an invisible boundary, separating their roles and responsibilities in this world. The footsteps were muffled, the shoes touching the carpet, hiding every detail beneath them, as if they were not allowing this moment to penetrate too deeply into his consciousness. With a slight smile, Fervin stopped, turned to his interlocutor, and confidently stated that despite all the worries, nothing bad had happened. Everything was under control.